Don't touch me. Her voice cracked barely above a whisper, but her hand never shook. The gun was pointed straight at his chest. He could have laughed, could have walked away, could have let her bleed right there under that old railway bridge while the rain came down in sheets and the siren stayed silent. He didn't. Ethan Walker, Hell's Angel ex-Marina man, the Pittsburgh police had tried to lock up 14 times, dropped to his knees in the mud beside a dying cop and said 4 words nobody expected. I've got you, kid. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you nothing about this is what you think. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight by the time Ethan Walker crossed under the Allegheny Valley Rail Bridge, and he almost didn't stop. Almost. Later, when reporters would ask him what made him pull over, he wouldn't give them a dramatic answer. He wouldn't talk about instinct or fate or gum. He'd just stare at the table in front of him and say, I saw the lights. The lights of a police cruiser. Crumpled against the concrete embankment like a tin can someone had kicked down a flight of stairs. The windshield completely gone. The driver's side door hanging open at a wrong angle, twisted on its hinges. And the radio crackling unanswered, calling out a badge number into the wet, dark air with no one to hear it. Ethan had spent 22 years learning to ride past exactly this kind of scene. You saw something, you kept moving. That was the code. Not because bikers were heartless, though plenty of cops believed they were, but because stopping meant questions. Questions meant your name in a report. Your name in a report meant a detective with a grudge in a slow Tuesday would start digging into everything you'd ever touched. He had 17 men depending on him. He had a chapter to protect. He had a past with the Pittsburgh PD that made person of interest feel like a compliment. He pulled over anyway. Later, he would tell Detective Harris in a cold interrogation room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead that he still didn't know exactly why. I couldn't make my hands keep going, he said. I tried. My hands just stopped. He killed the engine. He sat there for 2 full seconds, listening to the rain hammer the bridge above him and the radio in the wrecked cruiser call out a number. Nobody answered. Then he swung off the bike and walked toward the car. She was maybe 15 feet from the cruiser, on her hands and knees in the mud, dragging herself away from it. Her uniform was soaked through. Her right arm wasn't working properly. He could tell by the way she held it, pressed tight against her body, the elbow locked at an angle that made his stomach turn. There was blood on the ground and a pattern that told him she'd been there for a while, not minutes, longer. She heard him coming before she saw him. Her head snapped up. And even with everything that had happened to her, even bleeding, even barely able to lift her own weight, her left hand found her holster and came up with her service weapon in a movement so clean and automatic that Ethan actually stopped walking. Stop. Her voice was tight with pain, but it wasn't weak. Don't you move. He stopped. He put his hands up, slowly, palms out the way you do when someone's finger is already on the trigger and you want them to keep thinking before they use it. She was looking at his chest, at the patch on his leather vest. 3 words she clearly recognized: Hell's Angels. Pittsburgh. You did this. It wasn't a question. Her jaw was set, her eyes were sharp, and even in the rain and the blood. In the dark, she was reading him the way a rookie cop who'd been well-trained reads a stranger. Looking for movement. Looking for a weapon. Looking for the lie. No, Ethan said. He kept his voice flat, and even the way he'd learned in the Marine Corps to talk to people who were scared enough to shoot someone. I just rode up. I found you like this. I don't believe you. That's fine. He didn't move his hands. But you're losing blood. I can see it from here. And if somebody was going to hurt you, I had about 6 better chances to do it before you pointed that at me. A pause. The rain was relentless. My radio, she started. It's transmitting, he said, but nobody's picking up. I heard it for a full minute before I stopped. He watched her process that. Watch the math move behind her eyes, the math that every cop does when something feels wrong about a situation, when the pieces don't add up, when the absence of a response starts meaning more than the presence of anything. How long have you been out here? She didn't answer, which told him the answer was bad. Look, Ethan said. He took 1 slow step forward, just one. She didn't fire. My name is Ethan Walker. I ride with the Angels, and I know exactly what that means to you. But right now, I'm the only person on this road, and your arm is wrong, and you've got blood coming from somewhere above your vest line that I can see from 10 feet away, and I'm not going to stand here and let you die on principle. You're not exactly my first choice of help. Her voice cracked a little on the last word, not from fear, from pain she was working hard to swallow. I'm your only choice of help, he said. So what do you want to do? Another pause. longer this time. He watched the gun. He watched her hand. He watched the exact moment when her body started to lose the argument with her mind, when the blood loss and the shock and the cold began to make holding that weapon up heavier than she could manage. The gun didn't drop. She lowered it. Controlled. Deliberate. Like she was choosing to, not like she was forced to. "My name is Grace Mitchell," she said. "And if you're lying about saying, I need you to know that I will find a way to make you regret it." "Fair enough," Ethan said. And then he crossed the distance between them and got to work. The first thing he did was assess, and the assessment was bad. 2 bullet wounds. One had gone through the meat of her upper left arm and exited clean, which was the good news. The other one hadn't. It had caught the edge of her vest, clipped her just below the protective plates on her right side, and something about the angle told Ethan the vest had slowed it, but not stopped it. He'd seen this in Fallujah. He knew what it looked like when a round did enough damage that you couldn't tell yet how much damage it had done. He pulled his jacket off. He was already soaking wet. It made no difference. "This is going to hurt," he said. "Everything hurts," she said through her teeth. He pressed the jacket against the wound on her right side and held it. She made a sound, a single sharp intake of breath, and then went quiet. He watched her jaw clench. He watched her make herself stay still. "You military?" he asked. Not because it mattered, because talking kept people conscious. "No," a tight breath. "You Yeo. Marines, 2 tours." He adjusted the pressure. She didn't make a sound that time. "You're tough," he said. "I've had grown men cry at less. I'm not going to cry in front of a Hell's Angel." Despite everything, there was something almost wry in her voice, something that surprised him. "Good," he said. "Save it for later. Can you stand?" "I don't know." "Let's find out." It took 3 attempts, and it was ugly, and she hated every second of needing his help to do something she'd done 10,000 times without thinking. He could feel that in her, the frustration underneath the pain, the sheer stubbornness of a person who did not want to be carried. She wanted to do it herself. She was going to make herself do it herself, even if it killed her, almost literally. "Stop," he said the second time she tried to stand without leaning on him and nearly went back down. "Stop. You're going to tear it open worse. Just put your hand on my shoulder, that's all. You're not asking me for anything. You're just using me as a post." "Okay." She looked at him for a moment. Something complicated moved across her face. Then she put her hand on his shoulder. They made it to his Harley. Now here is where a cleaner story would have a clear road and a hospital waiting like a beacon. Here is where the logistics would cooperate. They didn't. The hospital was 11 minutes east. But between the bridge and the hospital, there were 2 things Ethan hadn't counted on. The first was Grace, who lost consciousness for approximately 45 seconds while he was trying to get his phone out and call ahead. Just went out like a light slumped against him, and he had to catch her with his free arm and hold her up one-handed while his heart did something it hadn't done since a firefight in Ramadi. He patted her face hard. Hey, Mitchell, Grace, look at me." Her eyes came back, unfocused then sharpening. "Don't," he said. "Do not do that again." "I didn't do it on purpose," she managed. "Well, stop." His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "I don't know your blood type, and I am not watching you die on a Harley. Stay awake." "Are you yelling at me?" "Yes. Is it working?" "Kind of." "Good. Keep being annoyed at me. It's working." The second thing he hadn't counted on was a police checkpoint, 2 blocks from the hospital entrance setup. He'd find out later because of a completely unrelated incident across the city. 2 patrol units, blue and red lights going, officers in rain gear stopping every vehicle. He almost turned around. I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. He ran the math on it, what it meant to roll a Harley with a Hells Angels patch up to a police checkpoint at 2 in the morning with an unconscious cop on the back. He thought about what every officer at that checkpoint was going to see when their flashlight hit his vest. He thought about how fast the calculation would go wrong. But Grace's hand was starting to slip from where it had been gripping his jacket. "Hold on," he said, loudly. "Mitchell, hold on." He drove straight into the checkpoint. Yeah. What happened in the next 90 seconds would eventually require 4 separate official reports, 3 officer interviews, and 1 very long conversation between the police commissioner and the union rep to fully document. But the short version is this. Ethan Walker rolled a Harley-Davidson into a police checkpoint at 2:14 in the morning with a wounded officer who was barely conscious on the back. He stopped immediately when ordered. He kept his hands visible. He said, and this was on the checkpoint's dash cam audio, "She's a cop. Officer down. I need a bus right now, and you can handcuff me to whatever you want once she's in an ambulance." He said it once. One of the officers, a 6-year veteran named Rodriguez, who had a sister in the Army, later said that in that moment he made a decision based entirely on what he saw in front of him, not on what he expected to see. The guy's hands were soaked through. He'd used his jacket as a compress. I could see where the blood had gone through it. That doesn't happen if you're the one who shot someone. I looked at his hands and I believed him. Rodriguez called it in. Another officer got Grace off the bike. The ambulance was there in less than 3 minutes. And then 3 other officers put Ethan Walker's hands behind his back and cuffed him to a patrol car door handle while he stood in the rain and watched the ambulance go. He didn't fight it. He didn't argue. He just stood there cuffed to a car in the rain and watched the lights disappear around the corner. Later, someone would ask him if that made him angry being arrested after saving someone's life. He'd shrug. I knew they would, he said. I drove in anyway. By 4 in the morning, Grace Mitchell was in surgery. By 4:15, Ethan Walker was in an interrogation room. The detective who walked in wasn't hostile exactly. Michael Harris was 51 years old, 23 years on the force, and he'd seen enough to know that the version of events that made the most sense wasn't always the right one. He'd also seen enough to know that a Hell's Angel in his interrogation room at 4 in the morning with a wounded officer's blood on his hands was not on its face a situation that called for open-mindedness. He set a cup of coffee on the table. Ethan looked at it, didn't touch it. You want to walk me through tonight, Harris said. He kept his voice neutral, professionally neutral, the kind that's been practiced until it doesn't cost anything to hold. I've told 3 officers already. Now you're telling me. Harris pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. From the top, Ethan looked at him for a moment. Not hostile, not afraid, more like a man trying to figure out how much truth to spend on someone he doesn't yet know deserves it. Then he told it, all of it, exactly as it had happened. He didn't explain or justify or try to shape it. He just moved through it event by event, start to finish in the flat, stripped-back way of someone who learned a long time ago that the truth is the only story you never have to remember. Harris listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't write anything down. He just listened, watching Ethan's face, watching the way his hands stayed still on the table, watching the places in the story where the pauses were and the places where they weren't. When Ethan finished, Harris was quiet for a moment. You had a gun, he said finally. Ethan looked at him. I ran your registration when you came in, Harris said. You carry a licensed Glock 40. You had it on you tonight. I did, Ethan said. She pointed a weapon at you. She did. And you didn't draw. Harris let that sit in the air between them. No, Ethan said. Why not? Ethan looked at the coffee cup. He still didn't touch it. Because she was scared and she'd been shot, and she was pointing a gun at the last person on earth she wanted to trust her life to. He paused. I wasn't going to make it worse. Harris looked at him for a long time. I need to verify everything you've told me, Harris said finally. I know. You understand you're not free to leave. I know that too. Harris stood. He reached over and slid the coffee cup to where Ethan's hand was resting on the table. Then drink your coffee. It's going to be a long morning. He walked out. He closed the door. And in the hallway outside, he stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. 23 years on the job, and Michael Harris had heard a lot of stories in that room. He'd heard good liars and bad ones. He'd heard people who cried and people who didn't. He'd heard innocent men who sounded guilty and guilty men who sounded innocent. He'd never heard anyone who sounded exactly like that, like someone who had simply told him what happened. He pulled out his phone and called the hospital. He asked about Grace Mitchell. She was in surgery, the voice on the other end said. Touch and go. Harris closed his eyes. Touch and go. He stood there in that hallway for a moment, and then he went to pull the dispatch logs from the night's calls. The logs for the call that sent Grace Mitchell out to that bridge were gone. Not misfiled, not delayed, gone. Harris stood at the terminal and stared at the screen, and somewhere in his chest, something shifted. Something that had been sitting comfortably in the category of open and shut moved into a category he'd spent 23 years learning to dread. Something was very, very wrong here. And it wasn't the man in leather sitting in his interrogation room. Grace Mitchell came out of surgery at 6:47 in the morning. The surgical team had worked for nearly 3 hours. The round that had caught the edge of her vest had done what they'd feared, fragment damage. Internal bleeding close enough to something critical that the surgeon would later tell Harris with the matter-of-fact calm of someone who'd stopped being theatrical about close calls years ago. Another 40 minutes and we weren't having this conversation. She was sedated. She would be out for hours. But before they put her under in the short window in the ER, when she was still conscious, and Harris had pushed his way in to check on her, she had said something, just a few words. barely above a whisper with an oxygen mask pushed to the side of her face. Harris leaned down to hear her. The call was fake, she said. It was someone called it in through dispatch. Used a department code. I thought it was real. She had to stop, breathe. Ethan, the biker. He didn't do this. He found me. He brought me here. Harris looked at her. You're sure? I'm sure. Her eyes were direct and steady despite everything. He's not the one, detective. Don't make him the fall guy. She let the oxygen mask be replaced. Harris stood up stricken. He walked out of the ER. He walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat, and then he made a phone call that he knew, even as he dialed, was going to change the next several weeks of his life. Internal affairs, he said when someone picked up. I need to speak to someone now, not later. Now I have a situation that cannot wait until Monday morning. Outside his car window, the rain had stopped, and for the first time since he'd walked into that interrogation room, Michael Harris felt something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt like a man who was just now beginning to understand the actual shape of the thing in front of him. And it was much, much larger than one wounded officer and one unlikely rescuer. Much larger. And whoever had set it in motion, whoever had made that fake dispatch call, whoever had erased those logs, whoever had sent a 25-year-old rookie cop out to a deserted bridge at 2 in the morning with no backup, they had made one mistake. She survived. The call to internal affairs took 11 minutes to route to the right person. Harris had been on hold, sitting in his car in the hospital parking lot, listening to institutional silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that government phone systems specialize in: empty, indifferent, designed to make you feel like whatever you're about to say can wait until someone more important has finished their coffee. He didn't hang up. When Special Agent Diane Cho finally picked up, she sounded like someone who had been awake for a while and wasn't happy about it, but was professional enough not to let the unhappiness become the other person's problem. Cho, she said. Just that, one word. A period, not a question mark. This is Detective Michael Harris, Homicide, Pittsburgh PD. He kept his voice level. I have a situation involving a potentially falsified dispatch call, an officer-involved shooting victim, side note perpetrator, and missing radio logs from tonight's shift. I need to know if you've had any prior flags on my department's communication systems in the last 6 months. A pause on her end, not the pause of someone deciding whether to take him seriously. The pause of someone who already knew the answer and was deciding how much of it to give him. What's the officer's name? Cho asked. Grace Mitchell, rookie 8 months on the job. Another pause, shorter this time. Stay where you are, detective. Don't talk to anyone in your department about this call. Don't go back to your precinct until you hear from me. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. She paused again. Harris, the logs that are missing, was it just tonight's shift? Something in the way she asked it turned his stomach cold. I only checked tonight's. Check the past 3 weeks, she said. Then call me back before you talk to anyone. Anyone. You understand what I mean by anyone? He understood exactly what she meant. Yes, she hung up. Harris sat in his car and looked at the hospital entrance. 3 weeks of logs. She'd asked him about 3 weeks of logs without hesitation, which meant internal affairs already had a thread on this department, which meant whatever Grace Mitchell had stumbled into wasn't new. It had been building. Quietly in the background, while everyone went about their shifts and filed their reports and trusted the system they worked inside, he got out of his car and went back inside to check on his officer. And in the interrogation room across the city, Ethan Walker sat with his untouched coffee and waited with the particular patience of a man who has learned that the world moves on its own schedule, regardless of what you want from it. He'd been in worse rooms. He'd waited out longer nights. He pressed his back against the chair, closed his eyes, and did the same thing he'd done in a forward operating base in Fallujah. When the waiting was the hardest part, he just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady and even, because panic burns fuel you might need later, and there is never a good reason to spend it early. The door opened at 7:22 in the morning. It wasn't Harris. It was a younger detective, maybe 35, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that looks like it was designed for intimidation, who walked in and sat down hard in the chair across from Ethan and put both fists on the table and leaned forward and said, "Let's talk about what you actually did last night." Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the detective's face. He looked at the fists on the table. He looked at the angle of the man's shoulders forward, aggressive, already decided. "I've given my statement," Ethan said. "Your statement is garbage." The detective, his nameplate said Doyle. Doyle kept his voice low and controlled, but the control was a thin skin over something hot underneath. "You think I don't know who you people are? You think I haven't been watching your chapter for 2 years? You ride past that bridge every Thursday night on your way back from your meeting house. Every Thursday. Like clockwork. That's not a crime, Ethan said. No, but shooting a cop is. Ethan looked at him steadily. I didn't shoot anybody. You were right there. I was right there after. That's different. Is it? Doyle leaned in closer. Because here's what I see. I see a Hell's Angel who knows that stretch of road better than anybody. I see a Hell's Angel who somehow appears at the exact scene of an ambush on a police officer within what minutes of it happening. I see a man with a record with priors, with known connections to organizations that have every reason to want police presence in this city reduced. My record doesn't include shooting anyone. Records miss things. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "Did Harris send you in here?" Something moved across Doyle's face. Quick, almost invisible, but Ethan had spent 20 years reading rooms and reading people, and that flicker told him everything he needed to know. Harris is occupied, Doyle said. I'll wait for Harris, Ethan said. That's not how this works. I've given my statement. I've answered every question 3 times. I've been cooperative. Ethan put his hands flat on the table. I want to speak to a lawyer and I want to wait for Detective Harris. You can stay in this room or you can leave, but I'm done talking to you. Doyle's jaw tightened. He stared at Ethan for a long moment, the kind of stare designed to make people feel the weight of authority pressing down on them, to make them feel small and boxed in and without options. Ethan had been stared at by men in a lot worse situations than this. He sat perfectly still and waited. Doyle stood up, his chair scraped back loud on the floor. He picked up the folder he'd brought in, which Ethan now noticed he'd never once opened, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle, didn't turn around. You should have kept writing, he said. Maybe, Ethan said, but I didn't. Doyle walked out. Ethan waited until the door was fully closed. Then he let out a slow breath. He picked up the coffee cup, cold now, and finally drank from it. It tasted like burned cardboard and institutional indifference, which was roughly what he'd expected. But here was the thing that Doyle's little performance had told him beneath all the bluster and the fists on the table, and the preloaded accusation. Doyle had never asked him a single new question. He hadn't been fishing for information. He'd been delivering a message. You should have kept writing, not a threat about a criminal investigation, a message about a choice. Ethan set the coffee cup down and looked at the wall in front of him and thought about what it meant that a Pittsburgh detective wanted him to wish he'd left a wounded cop to die in the mud. It meant the wounded cop had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and it meant someone in this building already knew it. He was still thinking about that when Harris came through the door 40 minutes later, looking like a man who had aged 3 years in one morning. You had a visitor, Harris said. It wasn't a question. Doyle, Ethan said. Harris closed his eyes briefly. What did he say? Told me I should have kept writing. Ethan watched Harris's face. That means something to you. More than it should. Harris sat down. He didn't have the folder this time. He just sat down like a man who needed to sit somewhere and think, and this happened to be the room he was standing in. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. I've been answering things straight all night. I know. Harris leaned forward on his elbows. When you were with Officer Mitchell, under the bridge before you moved her, she say anything to you? Anything about why she was there, what she was responding to? Ethan thought back. The rain, her gun coming up, the careful, excruciating process of getting her onto the bike. She was fading in and out, he said. She said something like she'd been called out there, that it came through as a distress call. Officer needs assistance. He paused. She said she couldn't raise anyone on her radio after she arrived, like the channel was dead. Harris was very still. She said it like it surprised her, Ethan added. Like she'd expected backup and it just never materialized. Harris stood up abruptly. He walked 2 steps toward the door and then stopped himself. Turned back around. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who has just watched 2 puzzle pieces fit together and does not like the picture they're making. 3 weeks, he said more to himself than to Ethan. It's been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of what? Ethan asked. Harris looked at him. For a moment, Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. Then Harris said, dispatch irregularities. Calls that got routed wrong, response times that don't match log times, small things. The kind of small that looks like technical error until you put 30 of them in a row and realize the pattern. Someone's been running the board, Ethan said. Harris looked at him sharply. Controlling dispatch, Ethan said. Routing calls, making sure certain things get responses and certain things don't. He'd seen something similar in Fallujah, not with police dispatch, but with military communications. Someone cutting a unit off from support by controlling what information moved and when. Grace wasn't ambushed at random. Someone knew she'd respond to that call. Someone made sure she'd go alone and made sure no one would come when she didn't check back in. Harris was looking at him differently now. Not like a suspect, like something else. Something Harris wasn't entirely comfortable with. "You should have been a detective," he said, and it didn't sound entirely like a compliment. "I should have been a lot of things," Ethan said. "Right now, I'd settle for not being handcuffed to the furniture." Harris glanced at the cuffs on Ethan's wrist looped through the chair arm. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket, produced a key, and uncuffed him without another word. Ethan looked at him. "Don't make me regret that," Harris said. "You really going to let me walk out of here?" "You're not walking out. You're being released pending investigation. Technically, you're a material witness, not a suspect." Harris paused. "But I want your number, and I want your word that you don't disappear." "I don't disappear," Ethan said. He stood up and rolled his wrist where the cuff had been. "I also don't forget who treated me straight." They looked at each other across that small fluorescent room, a 23-year veteran of the Pittsburgh police force, and a man whose entire history should have made them enemies, and something passed between them that neither of them would have known how to name out loud. "Her name is Grace Mitchell," Harris said, "and she asked me not to make you the fall guy." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She conscious?" "Not yet, but she was right before surgery." Harris picked up his folder from the table. "She said you were the last person she expected to trust, and you were the only one who didn't let her down." Ethan didn't say anything. He just picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, still damp, still marked with Grace Mitchell's blood, along the right side, and folded it over his arm. "She's going to make it?" he asked without turning around. "The doctor said yes," Harris said. "If it had been 40 minutes longer—" "It wasn't," Ethan said simply. He walked out. Harris watched him go. Then he picked up his phone and called Cho back. "I've got your 3 weeks," he said when she answered. "And I've got something else. We need to meet in person." The thing that Harris had was this 47 dispatch records across a 22-day period that showed micro-corrections. Individual calls where the assigned unit was switched at the last moment, not by supervisors, not by shift commanders, but by someone with back-end access to the dispatch system. Someone who knew the architecture of how calls were routed and could move officers around like chess pieces without triggering any of the automatic flags built into the system. Because whoever did it knew where the flags were, which meant they'd either written the system or they'd been inside it long enough to map every tripwire. Cho met him at a diner 4 blocks from the hospital. She was smaller than her phone voice suggested, mid-40s, with the kind of face that was professionally neutral, in a way that didn't feel cold, more like still water. She'd 2 other agents Harris didn't know. She sat down across from him and put a recorder on the table with one hand and slid a cup of coffee toward him with the other. "Before you start," she said, "I need you to understand that this conversation doesn't go back to your precinct through official channels. Not yet. Whatever you tell me goes into a federal file and it stays there until we're ready to move. That means if you talk to your captain, your union rep, your partner, anyone on the inside, you potentially burn this before it has legs." "My partner is Doyle," Harris said. Cho looked at him carefully. "Say more." "He went into the interrogation room with my witness, without authorization, and told him he should have ridden away and left a wounded cop to die." Harris wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "And he wasn't asking, he wasn't investigating, he was delivering a message." Cho said nothing for a moment. Then she turned to one of the agents beside her. "Pull Doyle's financials, today." The agent nodded and stepped away from the table. Cho looked back at Harris. "Tell me everything from the top," he told her. It took 45 minutes. She didn't interrupt once. She had the kind of listening that was a skill, active and absolute, taking in everything and giving away nothing. When he finished, she closed her notebook and looked at him. "How long has Doyle been your partner?" she asked. 4 years, Harris said. "And in 4 years, nothing flagged for you." Harris looked at his coffee cup. This was the part that was sitting wrong in his chest, the part he'd been turning over since the parking lot. 4 years of shifts and case files and precinct coffee, and trusting that the man across the desk from him was the same kind of cop he was trying to be. 4 years of never once seeing a crack in it. "Nothing I could name," Harris said. "Small things maybe, cases that went cold faster than they should have. Witnesses who got nervous and recanted. At the time I thought," he stopped, "I thought it was just the job. I thought I was being cynical when I felt it. Turns out I wasn't being cynical enough." Cho looked at him steadily. "You're being honest with me right now." "I've been honest with everyone all morning," Harris said. It's starting to feel like the minority position. For the first time, the agent across from him let something that wasn't professional neutrality cross her face. something that might have been respect. There are 7 names on a preliminary list, she said. Officers we've been watching, not confirmed, not ready to act on, but watched. She paused. Doyle is number 3. Harris absorbed that. Number 1, he asked. Cho looked at him for a long moment. She was deciding something. He could see the calculation moving the internal argument about how much to give a precinct detective she'd known for less than 2 hours. She made her decision. Commander Richard Voss, she said, your department's head of tactical operations. Harris's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Voss, Richard Voss, who had been with the department for 19 years, who had given the commencement address at 6 consecutive police academy graduations, who had attended the funeral of every officer killed in the line of duty in Pittsburgh for the past decade and stood at the back with his arms folded and his face grave and his full-dress uniform immaculate, who had given a speech at Grace Mitchell's graduation 8 months ago that Harris had heard described as moving and inspiring and everything a young officer needed to hear to start her career, right? Voss, Harris said, it came out flat because there was no tone available to him in that moment that felt adequate. We don't have enough yet, Cho said. That's the honest truth. We have patterns. We have financials that are interesting but not criminal on their face. We have a dispatch system that's been manipulated by someone with deep access and a very sophisticated understanding of how to cover their tracks. She leaned forward slightly. But we don't have a person walking into a courtroom because we don't have someone who was there. Harris looked at her. Officer Mitchell, Cho said, when she wakes up and every conversation she has from that point forward is going to be important. What she remembers, what she saw before the ambush, whether she can identify who called her out there. She said the call came through as a legitimate dispatch, Harris said. She heard a voice, Cho said, or she heard a recording, or she heard a system-generated call that was custom-built to send her to that bridge specifically. She sat back. We need to know which one, because if it was a voice and if she can identify it, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Harris stood up. I need to get back to the hospital. Harris, Cho stopped him. Go in civilian clothes. Don't tell the hospital staff you're investigating anything. You're just visiting a colleague. She looked at him hard. And if anyone from your department, anyone asks why you're there, you're checking on a friend. Understood. One more thing. Her voice dropped slightly. The biker. Walker. Where is he? I released him this morning. He's a material witness. She nodded slowly. Keep track of him. Not officially. Just know where he is. She paused. He may be the safest person in this whole situation right now, because whatever is happening inside your department, he's not part of it. Harris looked at her. That's an unusual recommendation from Internal Affairs. This is an unusual morning, Cho said. Harris walked out of the diner. The sun was fully up now, and the streets were carrying the ordinary weight of an ordinary weekday morning in Pittsburgh. People going to work, cars moving life, doing what life does, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in a hospital bed, a 25-year-old cop was fighting her way back from the edge of something that was not an accident. He was 2 blocks from the hospital when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered it. Detective Harris. The voice was male, careful, the kind of careful that has thought about what it's saying long before it says it. You don't know me. I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to hang up, and you will never be able to trace this call. Are you ready? Harris kept walking. Go ahead. The surveillance footage from the Allegheny Valley Bridge cameras for the 12-hour window surrounding last night's incident was accessed from inside the department at 3:40 this morning, an hour after Mitchell went into surgery. A pause. It wasn't deleted. Someone pulled it and copied it and replaced it with a clean loop from 3 days earlier. If you request it through official channels, you will get the loop. The original is gone from the server. Who is this? Harris said. Someone who has been watching long enough to be scared, the voice said. And then the line went dead. Harris stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone at his ear and the deadline humming faintly, and the ordinary morning moving around him as if none of it had the slightest interest in the thing that was detonating quietly in the middle of his chest. The footage was gone. The one piece of external evidence that would have shown definitively who was at that bridge, who had opened fire on Grace Mitchell, what direction they came from, whether they wore a uniform had been accessed, copied, and replaced with a fake by someone inside the department. At 3:40 in the morning, 20 minutes after Ethan Walker was brought in, someone had known he was in custody, had known the window was open, had moved fast and precisely to close off the one piece of evidence that would have cleared him quickly and pointed directly back at whoever actually pulled the trigger. They had wanted Ethan in that room for as long as possible. They'd wanted the case to stick to him. And if Grace hadn't survived, if those 40 minutes had gone the other way, it would have. Harris put his phone in his pocket and walked faster. In her hospital room on the third floor, Grace Mitchell was not as the doctors had predicted, still fully sedated. She had come up out of the anesthesia an hour ahead of schedule, the way some people do stubbornly against the grain, as if even their body's chemistry refused to comply with other people's timelines. A nurse had found her at 8:15 trying to reach her phone from the bedside table, which she absolutely should not have been doing, given that her right arm was in a pressure wrap and she had 2 IV lines running, and the effort of reaching 6 inches was costing her in ways visible on the monitors behind her. "You need to not do that," the nurse had said. "I need my phone," Grace had said with the particular precision of someone who is in significant pain and has decided that the pain is not relevant to the conversation. "You need to rest." "I need my phone first and then I'll rest." The nurse, who had 30 years of experience and had long ago learned that patients who come up out of anesthesia fighting are generally healthier than patients who don't, had handed her the phone. Grace had 1 bar of signal and a cracked screen from the ambush, but it worked well enough. She didn't call anyone. She opened her notes app, and with 1 functional hand and the focused deliberation of someone racing against the clock of their own body's demands, she typed out everything she could remember. The dispatch call, the time, the code used, the exact phrasing. The voicemail she thought possibly familiar, possibly synthesized, she couldn't be certain. The bridge, the headlights that appeared without a vehicle sound preceding them, which was the detail she remembered most clearly because it had struck her as wrong in the half second before the first shot, the way your brain registers wrong before it registers danger. The direction the shots came from, the number of shots she thought she'd heard before she went down, the detail she hadn't told anyone yet, the detail she'd been holding on to because she'd needed to be sure she wasn't misremembering it. She typed it out, stared at it, read it back. She wasn't misremembering it. She heard the door and looked up, and it was Harris. He looked like a man who had been awake for 24 hours and had received bad news at least 3 times in those hours, which was accurate. He stopped when he saw her eyes open. "You're awake," he said, which was somewhat redundant. "Evidently," she said. Her voice was rough from the tube they had had down her throat during surgery, and it hurt to use it, and she was using it anyway. "Close the door." He closed it. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before anyone else comes in, before anyone from the department checks on me. I need you to hear this, and I need you to know that I'm clear-headed and I know what I'm saying." Harris came to the bedside. He sat in the chair next to it. "I recognize the code used in the dispatch call," Grace said. "The officer needs assistance code. It was the right format. It was the right cadence. It came through the right channel." She paused to breathe carefully. "But here's what I know now that I didn't know when I took the call. That code, the specific variant used last night, was updated 3 weeks ago. New protocol. The old code was retired." She looked at Harris steadily. "I only know the new code because I was in the training session when it rolled out. The only people who would still use the code that was used last night, are people who learned it before the update. People who have been in the department long enough that the old code is muscle memory." Harris was very still. "It wasn't a civilian operation," Grace said. "It wasn't an outside job. Someone with years inside this department made that call." She held his gaze. "Someone who's been here long enough that they didn't even realize the code changed." Harris sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Mitchell," his voice was careful, "how are you feeling right now, honestly?" "Like I got shot twice and had surgery," she said. "But my head is clear and I know what I'm telling you." "I know you do." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small evidence bag. Inside it was a USB drive. "I need you to put your notes somewhere safe, right now. Before you tell me the last thing you wrote, I need you to send it to an external account that has nothing to do with the department." Grace looked at the USB drive. Then she looked at him. "How bad is it?" "The bridge camera footage has been altered," Harris said, "from inside the department at 3:40 this morning." Grace absorbed that. Something moved across her face, not shock exactly. More like the grim satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed in the worst possible way. "So they're still running it?" "Yes." "And they know I survived?" "Yes." She looked at the IV line in her arm. She looked at the door. She thought about the fact that anyone in this hospital wearing a Pittsburgh police badge could walk through that door at any moment, and she had no way of knowing which of those people were still the thing she'd signed up to be part of, and which ones had turned into something she'd never been trained to recognize. "I need you to call Ethan Walker," she said. Harris blinked. "The biker." I know who he is. She met Harris's eyes directly. He found me when nobody else did. He brought me in when he had every reason not to. And right now, the list of people I trust inside this department just got very short very fast. She paused. He's not inside this department. Harris looked at her for a long moment. Already told Cho to keep track of him, he said. Good. Grace closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. One more thing. Commander Voss came to see me before my academy graduation. He pulled me aside. I thought it was to wish me well. He said, she stopped and her expression changed in a way that was hard to watch the expression of someone replaying a memory and seeing it differently than they did the first time. He said, in this job, the first thing you learn is who you can trust. Everything else is just details. I thought he meant it as encouragement. She looked at Harris. He was telling me something else entirely, wasn't he? Harris didn't answer. He didn't have to. Grace looked at the door again. At the ordinary, terrible fact of it, the closed door of a hospital room, and the question of what was on the other side of it. Okay, she said quietly, not a word of defeat, a word of decision. The voice of someone taking hold of the thing in front of them with both hands, even when both hands are barely working. Okay, then let's figure out how to prove it. Harris walked out of Grace's hospital room, carrying two things: a photograph on his phone of her handwritten notes and the weight of a name he couldn't say out loud to anyone in his department. Richard Voss, 19 years, commendations, funerals, graduation speeches. The man who stood at the back of every ceremony with his arms folded and his face grave, looking exactly like what everyone needed him to be. Harris walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and while he waited, he did the thing detectives do when they've just had the floor shift under them. He went back through every interaction he'd had with Voss in the last 3 years and looked at it differently. Every case file Voss had reviewed, every assignment that came down through Voss's office. Every time Harris had felt that faint, dismissible unease about a decision and told himself he was being paranoid. He wasn't being paranoid. The elevator opened. He got in. He pressed the lobby button and stood very still all the way down. His phone buzzed before he reached the ground floor. Cho, he answered immediately. Doyle's financials, she said without preamble. In the last 18 months, 3 deposits that don't match his salary. Each one structured just under the reporting threshold. Each one routed through a different account. She paused. He also made 4 calls to a prepaid number in the past 2 weeks. The prepaid is burned, we can't trace it forward. But we can trace the tower pings backward, and 2 of them put that phone within 3 blocks of the Allegheny Valley Bridge. Harris stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. He moved to a corner away from the foot traffic, lowered his voice. 2 of them when, one 4 days ago, one the night before last. Cho's voice was precise and flat, the way it got when she was delivering information she didn't want to sit with emotionally. Someone was doing location reconnaissance on that bridge, Harris. This wasn't improvised. They chose that spot, they checked it, they set it up. And they sent Grace there alone. Cho confirmed. The question I need you to sit with is why her specifically? 8 months on the job. Rookie. Why not ignore her? Harris had been sitting with exactly that question since he'd left Grace's room. She saw something, he said, or she was about to, something that happened before the ambush. He thought about what Grace had told him about the dispatch code about Voss. She'd been in the tactical operations training rotation last week. Voss runs that rotation personally. A silence on Cho's end that was not empty. It was the silence of a piece moving into place. What kind of training? Communication protocols, dispatch architecture, how the department routes high-priority calls. Harris leaned against the wall. If she sat in a room with Voss for a week and he walked them through the system, if she saw something in the system she wasn't supposed to see or heard something, or just asked the wrong question. She wouldn't even have known it was the wrong question, Cho said. No, Harris said. She'd have thought she was just being thorough. He closed his eyes for a second. Grace Mitchell. 8 months on the job, sitting in a tactical training room asking careful questions, because that's what she did, and not knowing that every careful question was being registered by a man who had spent 19 years making sure no one looked at the right things clearly enough to understand them. She's smart, Cho. She's really smart. And I think Voss saw it. He moved fast, Cho said. He's been managing this for years. Fast is easy when you've built the infrastructure. Okay, Cho's voice shifted, decisive, tactical. I need 48 hours. We're requesting federal authorization for a full wire on Voss and Doyle, but that takes time and I need it done right, because if this goes to trial, I don't want a single piece of evidence challenged on procedure. Can you keep Mitchell safe for 48 hours without triggering anyone in the department? I'm working on it, Harris said. Work faster, Cho said. And Harris tell me you didn't put Mitchell in a room with a standard duty officer for protection. He hadn't. He'd told the hospital to list her under an alias and restrict visitor access to family only. But the duty log from the department would still show she was alive. Anyone who wanted to find her only needed to pull the hospital assignment from the system. I need to move her, Harris said. Yes, Cho said. You do. He hung up. He stood in the corner of that hospital lobby for exactly 4 seconds, running the options. Who could he call? Who on his floor was clean, genuinely clean, not just uninvolved? Who could he trust to put a body between Grace Mitchell and whatever came next without tipping off the wrong person? He had a very short list. And then with the slightly disorienting clarity of a thought that arrives from somewhere you didn't expect, he thought of Ethan Walker. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number Ethan had given him before walking out of the interrogation room. Ethan picked up on the second ring. Harris, where are you, my place? Why, I need a favor, Harris said. And I need you to understand before I ask it that this is not official. This is not a department request. I am calling you as a private citizen, asking another private citizen for help. And whatever you do with this information, the department has no knowledge of it. A pause. That's a strange way for a detective to open a conversation. It's a strange morning, Harris said. Mitchell needs to be moved. Today, quietly, in a way that doesn't go through any official channel that someone with access to department systems could track. He stopped. Let that sit. I have nobody I trust to do it cleanly. Nobody in the department I can use right now. Another pause. Longer. So you're calling a Hell's Angel, Ethan said. His voice was flat, not sarcastic, more like a man reading a situation back accurately. I'm calling the person who already proved they'll do the right thing when the wrong thing would be easier, Harris said. Yeah. The silence on the line was brief. Whatever Ethan's internal calculation was, it moved fast. What do you need? A vehicle that's not registered to anyone connected to the department. Somewhere safe to take her that is not a hotel, not a precinct, not anywhere. Someone with a database and a bad motive could run a search and find her. And people around that location who I can be reasonably confident are not on a corrupt cop's payroll. You're describing a Hell's Angels safe house, Ethan said. I'm describing whatever you've got that fits those requirements, Harris said carefully. Those are the same thing. Yes, Harris said, I know. Another pause. You understand what you're asking. You understand that if this comes out, I understand that if it doesn't come out, a 25-year-old officer who survived something she shouldn't have survived may not survive the week, Harris said. So yes, I understand what I'm asking. Do you understand what I'm asking? Give me 2 hours, Ethan said. He hung up. Harris stood in the hospital lobby and stared at his phone for a moment. Then he went back upstairs to tell Grace Mitchell that her protection detail for the next 48 hours was going to be a motorcycle club and that she was going to have to decide whether her instincts about Ethan Walker extended to every man who rode with him. Grace heard him out. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she looked at the ceiling for a moment with the particular expression of someone processing something that is simultaneously absurd and completely logical. The Hells Angels, she said, the local chapter, Harris said, Walker's people. I've spent 8 months learning how to arrest those people. I know. And now you want me to let them babysit me. I want you to stay alive, Harris said. And right now, that means staying invisible. They can do invisible better than we can. Grace looked at him. You trust Walker. I trust what he's done, Harris said carefully, which is more than I can say for several people I've worked with for years. Grace looked down at her hands, at the IV line, at the pressure wrap on her right arm. She looked like someone taking full inventory of their situation with the particular honesty of a person who no longer has the luxury of comfortable assumptions. Okay, she said, for the second time that morning. Same words, same tone, same quality of decision behind it. Okay, but I want to talk to him directly before we move. Fair enough, Harris said. He called Ethan back, told him. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Ethan said, put her on. Harris handed Grace the phone. She held it with her one working hand and put it to her ear. Walker. Mitchell. His voice was the same as she remembered it from under the bridge, flat, no performance, no effort to be something for her. Harris says you want to talk. I want to know one thing, she said. Last night, you could have kept riding. You knew what would happen if you stopped. So tell me, why didn't you? A pause, not hesitation. The pause of someone who doesn't usually explain themselves being asked sincerely to try. Because you were alive, Ethan said, and you were going to stop being alive if nobody did something. That's it. There's no better answer. Grace was quiet for a moment. That's actually a pretty good answer, she said. I know, he said. Now let's figure out how to keep you that way. She handed the phone back to Harris. The logistics of moving a hospital patient without a hospital knowing about it, and without a police escort, and without leaving a paper trail, are, to put it plainly, a nightmare. Harris spent the next hour and 40 minutes managing those logistics through a combination of a sympathetic ER physician who owed him a favor from 3 years back, a medical transport form that was technically valid but routed through a private service rather than a department account, and a level of improvisation that he suspected would either save everything or end his career. Possibly both. Ethan arrived with 2 vehicles and 3 men. The vehicles were unremarkable, a dark van registered to a body shop and a 4-door sedan that Harris deliberately didn't ask about. The 3 men were not what Harris expected, which probably said something about his own assumptions that he filed away for later. They were quiet, they were positioned correctly without being told to, and one of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who Harris later learned was called Dutch, had been a combat medic in the first Gulf War, and checked Grace's dressing with hands that knew exactly what they were doing and said without fanfare, "Fair, she can be moved. She needs to be horizontal for the first 2 hours and no stairs." Grace looked at Dutch while he worked and said, "You're a medic." "Was," Dutch said. "Good enough for now," she said. They moved her at noon. Ethan drove the van himself with Grace in the back and Dutch beside her, and Harris followed in his personal car to a location in Lawrenceville that Ethan had used before for situations that Harris did not ask about specifically and Ethan did not describe specifically, and which turned out to be a clean, quiet 2-story house with good sight lines from the front windows and a back exit that led out onto an alley. Harris stood in the front room of that house and looked at the 3 Hells Angels positioned around the perimeter and thought about how completely insane this would look in a report. Then he thought about Richard Voss standing at the back of police funerals with his arms folded and decided that insane was relative. Ethan came to stand beside him. "You look like you're having a crisis," he said. "I'm having several," Harris said, simultaneously. "That's normal." Ethan looked at the front window. "You get used to it." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be honest," Ethan said. "Comforting is for people with simpler problems." Harris almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. He drove back to the city with his phone in the cup holder and the name Voss sitting in his chest like a stone. He needed evidence, real evidence, not patterns and financial structures, and the testimony of a rookie cop who'd been shot twice and was currently being harbored by a motorcycle gang, which, however logically sound the decision was not going to look inspiring to a jury. He needed something that put Voss directly into the machinery, something that put his hands on the controls. I got it at 3:15 that afternoon from the last person he expected. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she was a 12-year veteran of the department's communications division. And she had been sitting on something for 6 weeks because she was afraid, and she was right to be afraid, and she knew it. She called Harris on his personal cell, which meant she'd gotten the number from somewhere she wasn't supposed to have it, which meant she'd been thinking about making this call for a while before she made it. "I need to meet you," she said. "Not at the precinct, not anywhere near it." Harris drove to the coffee shop she named. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at the back with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, and the posture of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say and is terrified of saying it anyway. She'd been running a diagnostic on the dispatch system 6 weeks ago, routine maintenance, and she had found a script running in the background of the system, a small, elegant piece of code buried 3 layers deep in the architecture where nobody would look unless they were doing exactly the kind of deep diagnostics she happened to be doing. The script didn't delete anything, it rerouted, in real time, based on triggers that someone had programmed in officer badge numbers, location identifiers, incident codes. When certain conditions were met, the script intercepted the normal dispatch routing and substituted a different one. It had been running for 8 months. 8 months, Harris said. "Since the system upgrade last spring," Sandra said. Her hands were very tight around the cup. "The upgrade expanded the back-end access permissions temporarily. Someone used that window to plan it. Did you report it?" She looked at him. The answer was in the look, complicated, ashamed, and then something harder moving underneath. "I reported it to my supervisor," she said. "The next day, my supervisor told me the diagnostic had been reviewed and there was no anomaly. That what I'd found was a legacy support script from the vendor." She paused. "It wasn't. I know what vendor scripts look like. I've been in this system for 12 years. "Who's your supervisor?" Harris asked. She told him. Her supervisor reported directly to Commander Voss. "Okay," Harris said. "Sandra, I need you to trust me right now. and I know that is a significant thing to ask given everything. I need you to write down exactly what you found, every detail. I need it documented, and I need a copy on a device that's not department issued, and I need it done today. If they find out I talked to you, they're not going to find out, he said, but I'm not going to pretend there's zero risk here. There is risk. You already know there's risk. You've been sitting on this for 6 weeks, which means part of you already knew what it meant. He met her eyes. The question is whether you're willing to let it mean something. Sandra looked at him for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive and set it on the table between them. I documented it 6 weeks ago, she said, the night I found it, before I reported it, because I had a feeling the report was going to go nowhere. She slid it toward him. I've been carrying this everywhere since then. I couldn't figure out who to give it to. Harris picked it up. He looked at it. He thought about the other USB drive, the one Cho had given him, the one with Grace's notes, and about the anonymous caller who'd known about the footage, and about Sandra sitting in this coffee shop for 6 weeks carrying proof of a corrupted system and not knowing who was safe enough to hand it to. All these people, all this weight, all being carried alone because the institution designed to be trustworthy had been made untrustworthy by the people at its center. Thank you, he said, and he meant it the way you mean something when the word is inadequate, but it's the only one available. He called Cho from the parking lot, gave her Sandra's name and the contents of the drive. Cho was quiet for a moment that felt like held breath, and then said, that's the mechanism. That's what we needed. That ties the system manipulation to a specific technical event, the upgrade window, and narrows the suspects to whoever had elevated back-end access during that window. A pause. Harris, that's probably a list of 6 people. And Voss oversees all of them, Harris said. Get me a copy of that drive in the next hour, Cho said. We're going to move on the federal authorization tonight instead of tomorrow. Harris drove. He was 20 minutes from Cho's field office when his phone rang. Unknown number, same careful voice as before. The person who'd told him about the footage. You moved her, the voice said. Harris's hand tightened on the wheel. What? Mitchell, she's not at the hospital. They're going to notice soon. A pause. Doyle ran her room assignment 2 hours ago. He didn't find her, and now he knows someone moved her, which means they're going to look. The voice was still careful, still measured, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter. They think she's with you, Winkerwimis. She's not with me, Harris said. I know, but they don't. Another pause. Harris, they're going to follow you. They may already be following you. Don't go to wherever she is right now. Harris checked his rearview mirror. Nothing obvious. But obvious wasn't the point. These were people who knew how to surveil without being seen because they'd been trained in exactly the same department Harris had been trained in. Who are you? Harris said. The pause this time was longer than before. Long enough that Harris thought the line might have dropped. Then the voice said, I'm someone who's been inside this long enough to know it can't keep going. And I'm someone who is not ready to give you my name yet, but I will be, soon. Another pause. Turn around, Harris. Don't go where you were going. Give it an hour. Lose whoever's behind you, then go. The line went dead. Harris drove for another 30 seconds. Then he turned right instead of continuing straight the exact opposite direction from Cho's field office. He drove for 20 minutes in a deliberate pattern, changing direction 4 times, and watched his rearview mirror with the focused attention of someone who'd been trained in surveillance and knew what he was looking for. On his 3rd direction change, he saw it. A gray sedan, 2 cars back. It had made the same 3 turns he'd made. His chest did something cold. He was being followed, inside his own city, by people from inside his own department, people who'd been trained in the same techniques he was using to try to lose them. He drove for another 15 minutes and gradually carefully used every counter-surveillance technique he knew. He went through a parking garage with 2 exits. He drove a pattern that required commitment to following him that became progressively more obvious. Eventually, the sedan didn't appear again. He pulled into a gas station parked at the pump and sat there with his hands on the wheel. They knew he knew, or they suspected, and they were watching him now, which meant the net was pulling tighter, which meant Cho's 48-hour window was already shrinking. He called Cho from a payphone inside the gas station. He hadn't used a payphone in 15 years. He didn't care. They're on me, he said without introduction. We need to move tonight. Cho's voice on the other end didn't waver. How sure are you? Gray sedan, 3 turns. Okay. A pause, just a second. Then she was back, fully decisive, the time for careful deliberation over. I'm activating tonight. We'll have enough for a warrant based on what Sandra gave us. It won't be everything, but it will be enough to start pulling threads. She paused again. Harris, Mitchell needs to stay exactly where she is and stay off any communication that could be traced. Can you get a message to her through Walker without using your phone? Yes, he said, because Ethan had handed him a note before he left Lawrenceville, a handwritten note with an address 2 blocks from the safe house. And the words, if you need to reach us without a call, send someone here. And Harris had put it in his jacket pocket and thought it was overkill at the time, and now he thought it was exactly right. He drove to the address. A garage. A man he didn't know answered the door, looked at him and said, Harris. Yes. Hold on. The man went inside. A minute later, he came back. Walker says, come in. Harris walked into a garage that had 3 motorcycles in various states of repair and 2 men sitting at a workbench. Ethan was on a phone call. He finished it in 30 seconds, looked at Harris and said, talk. Harris talked. He told him about the tale, about Cho moving tonight, about the anonymous source, about Doyle pulling Grace's room assignment. He told it fast and clean, the way he'd learned to brief, and Ethan listened the way he'd learned in the Corps to receive a briefing. Completely still, completely present, no interruption. When Harris finished, Ethan said, how many people do you think know where she actually is? You, me, Dutch. Your 3 guys, Cho, who I told in general terms. Harris paused. That's it? Then she stays where she is. Ethan's voice was certain. She moves and she creates exposure, stays put and she's invisible. He looked at Harris. What about your anonymous caller? You think they're on our side? I think they're on the side of this not going worse than it has to, Harris said, which right now is close enough. Ethan nodded. Then he said something that Harris didn't expect. I want to be there tonight, when you move on, Voss. Harris stared at him. You cannot be at a federal operation. I know that. Ethan met his eyes. I'm not asking to make arrests. I'm asking to know it happens in real time. He paused. I've got men out of their houses and away from their families to protect a cop they've never met. I want to know it was worth it while it's still happening, not 24 hours later on the news. Harris looked at him for a long moment. A Hell's Angel asking to be present, not involved, not armed, just present at the closing moment of a federal investigation. There was no policy for this. There was no protocol. There was no version of the rulebook that addressed this exact situation, because the rulebook had been written by people who never imagined the situation would exist. Harris made the kind of decision he'd been making all day, the kind that ignored the rulebook not out of carelessness, but out of a hard-eyed assessment of what the rulebook book was designed to protect, and the recognition that required going around the rulebook's edges. You stay in your vehicle, Harris said. You keep your phone on. I call you when it's done. Ethan considered that. I want a position where I can see the entrance of Voss's building. Harris almost said no. He thought about it for 3 full seconds. He thought about everything Ethan Walker had done in the last 18 hours and about what Grace had said. You didn't save a police officer. You saved a human being. And about the fact that this man had rearranged his world without being asked, without credit, without any reasonable expectation of either. Fine, Harris said, but you are a ghost. You don't exist. That's generally how I prefer to operate, Ethan said. Harris drove back to the city. He called Cho. He told her they were on for 9 o'clock. And in the safe house in Lawrenceville, Grace Mitchell was lying on a couch with Dutch sitting nearby reading a newspaper, and 2 men she didn't know positioned quietly around the house. And she was thinking about Richard Voss standing at the back of her graduation ceremony. She was thinking about the speech he'd given. She was thinking about how she'd felt hearing it, how it had made her feel like the job she was walking into was exactly what she'd believed it was, honorable, worth it, worth everything you had to give. She was thinking about how a man can stand in front of 200 people and tell them the truth about what it means to serve and be lying through every word of it. She heard Dutch turn a page of his newspaper. She heard one of the men shift his weight somewhere near the back of the house. She thought about Ethan Walker, about the fact that he'd handed his jacket to a cop who'd pointed a gun at him and hadn't asked for anything back. Not gratitude, not recognition, not even basic courtesy, which she admitted she hadn't been in a position to offer. She thought about what it meant that the person who crossed enemy lines to save her was the person the system had been designed to treat as the enemy, and that the people the system had been designed to trust had been the ones trying to kill her. She stared at the ceiling of an unfamiliar room and felt the particular vertigo of a worldview adjusting itself under enormous pressure. Not breaking, not collapsing, adjusting. The way something strong and honest adjusts slowly with difficulty and in the direction of something truer than what it was before. Dutch, she said. Yeah, he said from behind his newspaper. Why are you here, really? You don't know me. The newspaper came down. Dutch looked at her with the unhurried face of a man who has thought about a great many things for a long time. Walker asked, he said, that's it. Walker doesn't ask things he doesn't mean, Dutch said. 30 years I've ridden with that man. In 30 years. He has never once asked me to do something that wasn't worth doing. He looked at her steadily. So when he calls me at 9 in the morning and tells me there's a cop who got set up and nearly killed and needs protecting, I ask him one question. What question? Grace said. How fast do you need me there? Dutch said. He lifted the newspaper back up. Grace looked at the ceiling again. She thought she probably shouldn't be as moved by that as she was, but she'd been shot twice, and she was running on surgical anesthesia and the adrenaline afterglow of genuine mortal fear. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a 60-something combat medic had told her that 30 years of brotherhood meant you showed up when someone asked, no questions needed. She thought about her department, about what 30 years of that was supposed to mean, about what it was supposed to look like, about what it had actually looked like at 2 in the morning under a railway bridge. At 8:47 that evening, Harris texted Ethan a single address. Ethan texted back 2 letters. Okay, at 8:59 Cho's team was in position. 4 federal agents plus 3 local law enforcement from a neighboring jurisdiction, deliberately not Pittsburgh PD for obvious reasons. At 9:02, Ethan Walker parked his Harley 1 block from Richard Voss's apartment building and sat on it in the dark and watched the entrance with the same stillness he'd used to watch a lot of things in his life that mattered. At 9:04, there's lights in the lobby came on as Cho's team went through the front door with a federal warrant. At 9:07, Harris called Ethan's phone. It rang twice. Ethan picked up. We have him, Harris said. A silence on the line, not empty, full of something that didn't have a clean name, the compressed weight of an entire night of a woman bleeding in the mud, of a decision made under a railway bridge that had detonated outward in every direction until it reached this moment. And Mitchell, Ethan said. She's safe, Harris said. You can bring her in tomorrow. Cho wants her statement as soon as she's physically able. Another silence. Tell her, Ethan started. He stopped. Tell her Dutch says she's tougher than most of the guys he's served with. He wanted her to know that. Harris smiled. It was a small thing and tired and genuine. I'll tell her. Good. A pause. Harris. Yeah. You did all right, Ethan said, for a cop. Harris looked at the entrance of Voss's building and thought about 19 years in a graduation speech and the long, quiet work of someone building a house of corruption inside a house that was supposed to be made of something else entirely. You did all right too, Harris said, for a Hell's Angel. He heard something on the other end of the line that might have been a short, dry sound of amusement. Then Ethan hung up. And for the first time since 2:14 in the morning, since a motorcycle rolled into a police checkpoint in the rain, and a man with blood-soaked hands said, she's a cop, I need a bus, Harris felt the thing in his chest ease. Not resolve, not finish. The story was nowhere near finished. The investigation would take months. The trials would take longer. The damage done to a department in a city's trust would take years to repair, if it ever fully was. But Voss was in custody. Doyle was next. And Grace Mitchell was alive in a house in Lawrenceville surrounded by men who had every reason to leave her and had chosen without hesitation to stay. Harris put his phone in his pocket and walked toward the building. Behind him in the dark, he heard a motorcycle engine turn over deep, even unhurried, and then the sound of it moving away through the city streets, steady and sure, like a man who has done what he came to do and needs nothing from the doing of it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Richard Voss did not go quietly. That was the first thing Harris would tell people afterward, when people asked, and people would ask for months, the way they always ask about the moment when something large and long-standing finally falls. He didn't go quietly and he didn't go small. He went the way men go who have spent 19 years constructing a version of themselves so thoroughly that they've forgotten it's a construction. He went with indignation, with the particular fury of someone who believes genuinely and completely that the rules they've broken don't apply to people like them. When Cho's team came through the door of his apartment, Voss was in his kitchen. He heard them before he saw them, and he came out of that kitchen already talking, already performing, already. Standing at full height in his undershirt and slacks with the bearing of a man who has commanded rooms for 2 decades and cannot conceive of a room he doesn't command. Do you know who I am, he said. Flat, not a question, a statement of architecture. This is the structure of reality, and you are about to collide with it. Commander Richard Voss, Cho said. She held up the warrant. Yes, we know exactly who you are. Something crossed his face then. Quick as a blink. Not fear, not yet. Something more like recalibration. A man who has prepared for many versions of this moment, finding that the actual version is different from all of them. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Cho's badge. He looked at the three agents behind her and at the local officers by the door. And Harris watched him doing the math in real time, calculating whether this was manageable, whether there was still a play, whether the 19 years of armor he'd built was thick enough to absorb this. "I want my attorney," Voss said. His voice had changed. Not broken, adjusted. Professionally adjusted the way a man adjusts when he realizes the performance needs a different script. "You'll have your attorney," Cho said. "Right now, you're coming with us." He came. He walked out of his apartment in handcuffs with his chin level and his eyes forward, and Harris watched him do it and thought about all the funerals, all the ceremonies, all the times he'd stood at the back of a room full of people who trusted him and performed grief and honor so convincingly that nobody thought to look at what was happening underneath. The car door closed. Harris stood on the sidewalk for a moment after the vehicles pulled away. The street was quiet, ordinary. A Tuesday night in Pittsburgh, and somewhere under the ordinary surface of it, something that had been running for years had just stopped. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, expecting Cho or the field office. It was an unknown number. The careful voice. "It's done," the voice said. "I saw the vehicles." "Who are you?" Harris said, for the third time. He was going to keep asking until he got an answer, and he thought tonight might be the night. A longer pause than before. The kind of pause that contains a decision. "My name is Kevin Marsh," the voice said. "I'm a patrol officer, 9 years. I've been building a file on Voss and Doyle for 14 months. A breath. I didn't know who to give it to. I didn't know who was clean. Every time I thought I'd found someone, something happened that made me pull back. "You've been sitting on 14 months of documentation," Harris said. "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." A pause that carried the weight of what alone had cost him. "I have wife and 2 kids, detective. I needed to be sure before I put my name on anything. I needed to be completely sure." Harris understood that. He understood it completely and without judgment. "I need to meet you," he said. "I know," Marsh said. "Tomorrow, wherever you say." In the morning, same diner I used this morning. You know it?" "I'll find it." The line went dead. Harris put his phone in his pocket and looked up at the sky overcast, the city light bouncing off the clouds the way it always did, giving the night that flat ambient glow that Pittsburgh had at this hour. He thought about 14 months. About a patrol officer carrying a file through 14 months of solitary fear, watching the system around him be used against the people it was supposed to protect, trying to find the right person to hand the weight to. All these people carrying pieces of the same truth, Sandra with her USB drive, Marsh with his file, Grace with her notes. The anonymous caller who'd told him about the footage, which he now understood had been Marsh too, making careful contact before he was ready to give his name. None of them had been able to carry it alone all the way to the end, but together without even knowing they were together, they'd carried it far enough. He drove to the diner. He sat at a corner booth and ordered coffee he didn't need and stared at the table and let the events of the last 19 hours settle through him in layers, the way adrenaline eventually settles when the body accepts that the crisis has passed. His phone buzzed. Grace. She was texting from a burner phone Dutch had provided Smart, and the text said simply, "Harris. Did it happen?" He texted back, "Yes. Voss is in custody. You're safe." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then Doyle Harris typed, "Tomorrow." "Cho is building on tonight's arrest. He won't run. He doesn't know we have Voss yet." A pause. "Then tell me when it's Doyle. I want to know." He typed, "You'll know." Another pause. Longer. "Then thank Dutch for me and the others." Harris looked at that for a moment. A cop thanking a Hells Angels chapter for protecting her. He thought about how that sentence would have sounded 48 hours ago. He thought about how much had to break and rebuild for it to sound now simply like the truth. He typed, "I'll tell them." He put the phone down and drank his coffee and thought about what came next. Because what came next was the part that didn't have the clean energy of crisis driving it. What came next was testimony and depositions and evidence review and the slow, grinding machinery of federal prosecution, which moved on its own schedule and answered to no one's urgency. What came next was the hard, unglamorous work of dismantling something that had been built carefully brick by brick over nearly 2 decades. And what came next before any of that was the part Harris had been dreading since Cho first said Doyle's name. 4 years. He finished his coffee. He drove home. He slept for 4 hours, which was less sleep than he needed and more than he expected to get, and was back at the diner at 7:55 the next morning when Kevin Marsh walked in. Marsh was younger than his voice had suggested. Mid-30s, compact with the kind of careful eyes that were always reading the room. He sat down across from Harris and put a sealed envelope on the table and folded his hands on top of it and said, Everything I have is in there. Copies are in 3 other locations. If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Harris said. You couldn't have guaranteed that yesterday, Marsh said. Steady, not hostile. Harris looked at him. No, he agreed, I couldn't have. He picked up the envelope. 14 months. 14 months, Marsh confirmed. Walk me through what started it. Marsh wrapped his hands around a coffee cup the waitress had brought without being asked. He looked at the table for a moment, the look of someone organizing a story they've been holding inside for so long. It's taken on the shape of the space it's been stored in. A witness, he said, 14 months ago, aggravated assault case neighborhood in East Liberty. Good witness, solid, had seen the whole thing, willing to testify, no reason to recant. He paused. 2 days before trial, she calls the DA's office and says she's not testifying. Completely reversed. Wouldn't say why. He looked up at Harris. I went to see her. She wouldn't open the door, but I could hear her on the other side of it, and she said one thing through the door before she told me to leave. She said, I'm sorry, someone came to my house in a uniform and I can't do this. Harris was very still. Someone came to her house, Marsh said, in a uniform, which means either a co or someone in a police uniform went to a witness's home to intimidate her into silence before trial. He paused. I filed a report, internal channels. Nothing happened. The report disappeared. He looked at Harris steadily. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. And you started building the file instead of going up the chain. The chain was the problem, Marsh said simply. I didn't know how high it went. And I still don't know how high it goes. I know about Voss and Doyle, but I don't know if there are others. That's what scared me the most, not knowing the edges of it. Harris opened the envelope. He looked at the top page, a neatly organized table of incidents, dates, case numbers, and observations. 14 months of careful, disciplined documentation in the same plain style as Marsh's voice. Not dramatic, just true. This is good work, Harris said. It's terrifying work, Marsh said. Do you know what it's like to sit in a briefing with your commander and know what you know and have to sit there and nod? No, Harris said, but I know what it's like to find out your partner wasn't who you thought he was. That's its own version of it. Marsh looked at him. Doyle, Harris confirmed. Marsh nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted, not satisfaction, more like the grim recognition of a pattern confirming itself. I wasn't sure about Doyle, he said. I had him adjacent to 2 things, but nothing direct. He's direct enough, Harris said. Joe has his financials in the tower pings that put his phone near the bridge. He paused. He went into my interrogation room the morning after the ambush and told my material witness he should have left Mitchell to die. Marsh's jaw tightened. He knew she'd survived. Within hours, Harris said, he knew before the department officially knew. The implications of that moved across Marsh's face in sequence. Real time. Harris watched him understand what it meant that Doyle had been in communication with whoever ordered the ambush. That Doyle had known because he was part of the coordination. That for however long it had taken Grace to arrive at the bridge, and however long it had taken Ethan to find her, and however long the surgery had lasted, Doyle had been waiting for confirmation that it was over. And then it wasn't over, and he'd gone to the interrogation room to see what the biker knew. He went to check on loose ends, Marsh said. Yes, Harris said. Marsh looked at his coffee. God. Harris called Cho at 9:15 and read her the relevant sections of Marsh's file. She was quiet through most of it, with the careful quiet of someone storing information rather than reacting to it. When he finished, she said, bring Marsh in today. I want him on record before anyone in the department realizes Voss hasn't shown up for work this morning. How long before they realize? His assistant would have called at 8, Cho said. So they've had an hour, maybe less, to act on it. A pause. Harris Doyle is going to know something's wrong by noon, possibly sooner. If he runs, he won't run, Harris said. He'll go to his desk and he'll perform normal, and he'll try to find out what happened from inside before he makes a move. That's what someone who's been doing this for years does. They don't panic immediately. They gather information first. You're sure our Haiti? I know how he works, Harris said, and then more quietly, I've sat across from him for 4 years. There was a brief silence on Cho's end that understood what that cost him to say. Okay, she said, bring Marsh in. I'll have warrants ready for Doyle by 2 o'clock. I want to pick him up before end of shift when he's still in the building and hasn't had time to sanitize anything at home. Harris and Marsh drove to the federal field office. Harris walked Marsh through the lobby and into a conference room where 2 of Cho's agents were already waiting, and he introduced him with 6 words. Kevin Marsh, he's been building your case. Cho looked at Marsh for a moment. Then she extended her hand. Thank you, she said with the same directness Harris had come to recognize as her default mode. That took something most people don't have. Marsh shook her hand. He looked like a man who has been underwater for a long time and is only now allowing himself to believe the surface is real. I needed it to matter, he said. I needed it to count for something. It counts, Cho said. Sit down. Harris left them and drove back to the precinct. He walked in through the front entrance, same as always, and crossed the floor toward his desk, and the ordinary morning life of the department moved around him. Officers at desks, phones ringing, the coffee machine in the corner running its endless cycle. He looked at Doyle's desk as he walked past it. Doyle was there, seated, working, or performing working, which from the outside looked identical. Harris had looked at this exact scene, Doyle at his desk, relaxed, professional, doing the job 10,000 times. He had never once seen the performance underneath it. He was seeing it now, and the seeing of it made his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the investigation and everything to do with the particular pain of misplaced trust. Doyle looked up as Harris passed. Hey, he said. His voice was easy, normal, the voice of a man who was either genuinely calm or had spent years building the skill of sounding calm when he wasn't. Long night. Long morning, Harris said. He kept walking. He did not stop. He did not look back. He sat at his desk and opened his computer and worked on the paperwork that investigations always require, the documentation that transforms events into evidence. And he watched Doyle in his peripheral vision. Doyle made 2 phone calls. One of them was brief and apparently routine. Harris caught enough of the tone to read it as someone checking in with a normal work contact. The second one was shorter, and Doyle's body language changed subtly during it. A slight stiffening across the shoulders, a shift in how he was holding the phone. Harris couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. Doyle had just found out something, a contact, a communication. Some thread of the network, noticing that Voss had gone silent, had just told Doyle that last night something happened. Harris watched Doyle put the phone down, watched him stare at his computer screen for approximately 8 seconds, watched him pick up his coffee, take a sip, set it down, and then stand up with the deliberate casualness of someone who has decided to act before acting becomes impossible. Harris picked up his own phone and typed one word to Cho now. Cho's response came back in under 30 seconds en route. Doyle was putting on his jacket. He picked up his keys. He was moving toward the door with the measured pace of a man who wanted to look like he was going to lunch. Harris stood up. Mike, he said it the way you say someone's name when you've said it 1,000 times. Easy, familiar, the sound of 4 years of partnership in a single syllable. Doyle stopped, turned around, looked at Harris with an expression that was still professionally steady, but had something underneath it, now something that knew. Where are you headed? Harris said. Lunch, Doyle said. His voice was still level, still even, but the word had a slightly different quality than the same word would have had an hour ago. Like a note played in the right key, but on an instrument that's fractionally out of tune. Sit down, Mike, Harris said. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Something moved across Doyle's face. Fast. The calculation moving, the options narrowing in real time. His eyes went to the door. To Harris. To the door again. Sit down, Harris said again. Doyle sat. Neither of them said anything for 30 seconds. The department moved around them, phones, conversations, the coffee machine, indifferent to the fact that something was ending at this desk. Doyle looked at the surface of his desk, at his hands, at the coffee cup he'd put down. How long did you know? Doyle said finally. He wasn't asking about last night. He was asking about the real question, how long Harris had suspected, how long the awareness had been building in the man across from him. I didn't, Harris said. Not until Mitchell. He paused. You went into that room and told Walker to wish he'd let her die. You didn't know I hadn't sent you in there. Doyle was quiet. 4 years, Harris said. How long were you already in it before we were partnered? A pause. 3, Doyle said. So low it was almost not audible. 7 years. Harris absorbed that. 7 years of this man sitting inside a corruption that predated their partnership by 3 years, which meant when they'd first sat down across from each other, when they'd gone through the getting to know you period of a new partnership, when Harris had told himself he was building something with someone he could trust, Doyle had already been something else entirely for 3 years. Did you know about Mitchell in advance? Doyle looked up. Something moved across his face that Harris could not entirely classify. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse, exactly. Something more complicated than either of those. I knew she was going to be called out, he said. I didn't know, he stopped. You didn't know she was going to be shot, Harris said. I thought it was going to be a warning, Doyle said. I thought they were going to scare her, rough her up enough that she'd transfer out. Harris stared at him. She had 2 bullets in her mic. Doyle looked at his desk. I know. She was 40 minutes from dead. I know, Doyle said. And this time there was something in the two words that was different from everything else he'd said. Something fractured underneath it. Some weight that had been sitting for the 12 hours since he'd learned she survived and had been getting heavier with every hour. I know. The door opened. Cho walked in with two federal agents and a uniformed officer from outside the jurisdiction, and the department floor went very quiet, very fast, the way it does when something official and serious enters a room, and everyone can read the gravity of it. Doyle looked at Cho. He looked at the agents. He looked at Harris. "I'm sorry," Doyle said. To Harris, just to Harris, like the others weren't there. Harris looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what sorry meant in this context. He thought about what it covered and what it didn't, and whether it was genuine or whether it was the sorry of a man who was sorry he'd been caught. He thought about a rookie cop on a wet road bleeding into the mud and a man in this building who had known it was coming and had told himself it was just a warning. "Tell that to Mitchell," Harris said, "when she's ready to hear it." Cho read Doyle his rights. He stood for it and didn't resist and didn't perform and didn't say another word. Harris watched it happen from 4 feet away and felt the 4-year weight of it settle into its final shape, something that would eventually become a chapter in a very long investigation, a name in a very long list of charges, a story that a jury would hear and try to understand the shape of. He turned around and walked back to his desk. He sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment. His phone buzzed. "Grace, the burner. I heard. Is it done?" He typed, "Doyle is in custody. 30 seconds. Then okay, then after another pause, "I want to come in tomorrow. Give my official statement. I don't want to wait." Harris typed, "Cho wants you as soon as you're physically able. Grace, tell her tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock, I'll be there." Harris looked at that for a moment. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. The image of Grace Mitchell, arm in a pressure wrap, 2 days out of surgery, 25 years old, walking into a federal office to give the testimony that would anchor the prosecution of the people who had tried to kill her. Not because she had to, because she had decided that waiting was the wrong thing to do, and she was going to do the right thing at the pace she chose on her own terms, regardless of what her body was still arguing about. On type back, "I'll tell." Then he typed before he put the phone down, "Dutch says you're tougher than most of his guys." A longer pause this time. "Then tell Dutch he hasn't seen me on a bad day." Harris actually smiled. Not small this time. Tired, genuine, the kind of smile that arrives when the worst of something is over and the relief and the weariness land in the same moment. He put the phone down and got back to work. The days that followed moved fast and slow, simultaneously fast in the way that events move slow, in the way that institutions always process their own failures. By Wednesday, Cho's office had issued warrants for 4 additional officers whose names appeared in Marsh's documentation. By Thursday, the Pittsburgh Police Commissioner had called a closed-door meeting with the union leadership that lasted 3 hours and produced a public statement so carefully worded that it managed to say almost nothing while technically saying something. By Friday morning, the story was on the news, not the version Harris would have told. The news version was simplified, dramatized, compressed into the shapes that fit the segments allotted to it. Corrupt cops, criminal network, rookie officer targeted, Hell's Angel. Those were the pieces the story got reduced to, and Harris sat in his kitchen on Friday morning, watching the coverage and feeling the strange flat frustration of someone who knows how much weight and nuance is missing from a telling. But Grace's name was right, and Voss's name was right, and the fact of the corruption, the concrete, documented, federally prosecutable fact of it was right. He turned the television off. Ethan Walker saw the same coverage from the garage in Lawrenceville, where he was working on a transmission rebuild with Dutch and not particularly watching the news until someone turned it on, and his name appeared in the 3rd paragraph of a scroll at the bottom of the screen. Hell's Angels member. Ethan Walker, 42, has been identified as the individual who transported Officer Mitchell to the hospital. And he looked at it and then looked back at the transmission and didn't say anything. Dutch looked at the screen, looked at Ethan. "You're famous," Dutch said. "I'm on a scroll," Ethan said. "That's not famous, that's a footnote." "A pretty good footnote." Ethan handed him a wrench. "Hold this." Dutch held it. "Walker." "What?" "You did something." "I know I did something," Ethan said. "I was there." Dutch stopped. Tried again. Dutch was not a man who typically reached for words that didn't come easily. It mattered. What you did, it changed things." He paused. "I don't want you to just ride past that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the engine in front of him. He thought about a road and a bridge and rain and a woman pointing a gun at him with a hand that didn't shake. He thought about the 4 words he'd said, "I've got you, kid," and how they hadn't felt like a decision at the time, just a statement of fact, an inevitable thing. "She was alive," he said. "I've said it before." She was alive, and she was going to stop being alive. That's not heroism. That's just math. The math was right, Dutch said. Ethan took the wrench back. Yeah, he said, it was. His phone rang. Harris. He answered it. Detective? Walker. Harris's voice had the quality of someone who has been through something long and is on the other side of it now, not untouched, but intact. Grace gives her official statement tomorrow morning. I wanted you to know. She's up for that already. Nobody told her she wasn't. Ethan made a sound that was almost a laugh. How is she? Recovering, stubborn about it. A pause. She asked me to tell you something. Ethan waited. She said, Harris paused, and Ethan could hear the slight shift in his voice that meant he was reading something, maybe a text, maybe a note. She said, tell him I owe him one, and I always pay what I owe. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Tell her she doesn't owe me anything. I told her you'd say that, Harris said. She said to tell you she disagrees. She's wrong. I'll pass it along. She'll probably tell you herself. Harris paused. There's going to be a commendation. For you, from the department. He said it carefully, like someone delivering news they're not sure how it will land. Ethan was quiet for 3 full seconds. No, he said. Walker. No commendation, no medal, no ceremony. His voice was flat and certain. I don't want anything from the department. Not now, not after. I told Cho you'd say that too. Then you already know my answer. A pause. I don't need the department to tell me whether what I did was right. I already know whether it was right. I know, Harris said. I'm not arguing. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you're right. Some things don't need a ceremony. They just need to have happened. The line was quiet for a moment, just the ambient sound of two people who had been through something together, holding it between them without needing to describe it. Harris, Ethan said, yeah. When this is all done, the trials, the testimony, all of it, you come find me. I'll buy you a beer. A brief pause. I don't usually drink with Hell's Angels. I don't usually protect police officers, Ethan said. Apparently, we're both expanding our range. This time, Harris did laugh, short-reel the laugh of a man who has earned it by surviving the last 72 hours. I'll find you, he said. The call ended. Ethan put his phone in his pocket. He went back to work. Outside the garage, Pittsburgh carried on in its ordinary way, traffic and weather, and the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Inside a federal building downtown, Richard Voss sat with his attorney and looked at the documentation Cho had assembled and understood for the first time that the architecture he'd built was coming apart at every joint simultaneously. Inside a holding facility, Michael Doyle sat with 2 words echoing, tell Mitchell, and tried to figure out what sorry actually meant when it had to be carried all the way to a woman you'd helped put in the ground and somehow hadn't. Inside a house in Lawrenceville, Grace. Mitchell slept for 14 hours straight and woke up with the sun full in the window, and Dutch asleep in the chair across the room with a paperback open on his chest, and she lay there for a moment, just breathing in and out, steady, and even the most ordinary thing in the world, and thought about how she'd almost not been doing it. She thought about Ethan Walker's voice in the dark. I've got you, kid. She thought about what it meant to be gotten, to be seen in the moment you needed seeing by someone who had every reason to pass you by. She thought about what she was going to say when she gave her statement tomorrow, how she was going to tell the truth, all of it, clearly and completely, the way she'd been trained to the way she believed in. And then she was going to go back to work as soon as her arm allowed, as soon as the paperwork cleared. She was going to put her uniform back on and go back to the job she'd chosen. Because the corruption of some people inside a system was not the same as the corruption of the system itself, and she was not willing to let the worst version of the thing define what the thing actually was. It was still worth it. The job was still worth it. She looked at Dutch sleeping in the chair. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, okay, not defeat, not relief, decision. The word she kept coming back to, the word she kept needing, the word that meant she was still here and still choosing and still moving forward into whatever came next. Dutch's paperback slid off his chest. He jerked awake, looked at her. You're up, he said. I'm up, she said. He rubbed his face, looked at the window. How do you feel? She took inventory. The arm was pain on a scale she could manage. The side was worse, but manageable. The rest of her, the parts that weren't physical, felt like something that had been broken and was knitting back together along cleaner lines than it had been before. Better, she said. I feel better. Dutch nodded. He picked up his paperback, found his page, went back to reading. Grace Mitchell looked at the ceiling and felt a particular irreducible weight of being alive. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the plain and enormous fact of it, and let it settle over her like something she was going to carry forward. Not as a burden, as a given, as the ground under everything else that was coming. Tomorrow she would walk into a federal building and tell the truth. And the day after that, she would figure out what came next. Grace Mitchell walked into the federal building at 7:58 in the morning. She was 2 minutes early, which was exactly who she was, the kind of person who shows up before she's expected, not to impress anyone, but because being late felt to her like a form of dishonesty about how seriously you took the thing in front of you. Her right arm was in a sling. She was moving carefully the way people move when they've learned in a very direct way that their body has limits and ignoring those limits has consequences. But she was moving. Under her own power, through a federal building lobby, 8 days after 2 bullets and 3 hours of surgery had tried to make moving impossible. The agent at the front desk looked up, looked at her sling, looked at her face, said nothing beyond Officer Mitchell, and when she said yes, walked her to the elevator without making her wait. Chu was already in the conference room. Harris was there too with coffee he'd clearly been holding for a while. They both looked up when Grace came in, and the look on Harris's face was the specific look of a man who has been worrying about something for 8 days and is only now allowing himself to stop. You didn't have to come in person, Cho said. We could have done this at the hospital. I'm done being at the hospital, Grace said. She sat down. She put her good arm on the table and looked at Cho directly. Let's do this. They did it. For 3 hours and 40 minutes, Grace Mitchell gave her statement methodically, completely, without embellishment and without omission. She started with the dispatch call and moved forward through every detail. She'd recovered the code, the voice, the bridge, the headlights with no engine sound preceding them, the shots. She talked about the tactical training rotation with Voss. She talked about what she'd seen in the system during that week. A routing anomaly she'd flagged to Voss directly in a room with 2 other officers that Voss had dismissed as a legacy error. She talked about the moment under the bridge when she'd understood that her radio wasn't going to be answered. And she talked about Ethan Walker. She talked about him the way a witness talks about something. They need a room full of people to understand correctly, clearly, carefully, with the precision of someone who knows that the version of the story that survives the official record matters. He had every reason to ride away, she said. He had personal risk, legal risk, and 20 years of reasons to assume that helping a cop was not his problem. He stopped anyway. He used his own jacket as a compress. He got me onto his motorcycle and drove into a police checkpoint, knowing exactly what was going to happen to him when he did. She paused. I want that on the record, not as a detail, as a fact that stands on its own. Cho looked at her for a moment. It's on the record, she said. Good, Grace said. When it was done, when the recording had stopped and the agents had collected everything, and Cho had shaken her hand with the same direct, unhurried professionalism she brought to everything, Harris walked Grace to the elevator. How are you actually doing, he said. Not the question you ask in front of the room. The question you ask in the hallway. Grace looked at the elevator doors. I'm doing what comes next, she said. That's the only way I know how to answer that. Harris nodded. That's a good way to answer it. Harris, she looked at him. When does Voss go to trial? Cho's projecting 8 months, and he said. Maybe more. It's a federal case. There's a lot of material. I'll be there, Grace said. Every day of it. Front row. Harris looked at her. He thought about what that took, not just physically, not just logistically, but the sustained, deliberate act of showing up every day to watch someone answer for what they did to you, of not looking away, of insisting with your presence that the truth be heard all the way through. I know you will, he said. The elevator came. She got in. He watched the doors close and stood there for a moment in the hallway and then went back to work. What came next was months. Months of the kind of work that doesn't make for clean television, but is the actual substance of justice testimony, preparation, evidence review, chain of custody, documentation, the meticulous reconstruction of 8 months of system manipulation into a prosecutable narrative. Kevin Marsh spent 60 hours with federal attorneys going through every entry in his 14-month file. Sandra Okafor's USB drive became Exhibit A in a federal computer fraud charge that carried 15 years on its own. The anonymous tip about the surveillance footage, now attributable to Marsh, was documented, sourced, and entered into the record. 4 other officers were arrested in the first month, 3 more in the second. Each arrest pulled another thread, which led to another name, which led to another set of financial records, which led to another interview, which led back into the center of a network that had been growing quietly inside the Pittsburgh PD for the better part of a decade. Not since Voss arrived, but growing faster and wider under his management, his protection, his very particular skill for identifying who was useful, who was manageable, and who needed to be removed. The criminal organization Voss had been protecting turned out to have interests in 6 neighborhoods across the city. Illegal gambling, drug distribution, labor racketeering. Not glamorous. Cinematic, just profitable and methodical and deeply embedded in the ordinary life of the city in ways that took federal investigators the better part of 3 months to fully map. Grace followed every development. She was back on light duty at 6 weeks desk work, filing the administrative texture of the job that she'd been warned about in the academy and had told herself she wouldn't resent, and mostly didn't, because even filing felt like being back, like occupying the right space, like being where she was supposed to be. She had a conversation with her captain that she hadn't expected. He called her into his office on her first day back and shut the door and sat across from her and said without preamble, "I didn't know." His voice was direct and tired and carried the specific weight of a man who has spent 6 weeks sitting with the question of what he missed and why. "I want you to know that. I didn't know what was happening under my roof." Grace looked at him. "I believe you," she said, because she did. Some things you could tell by the quality of how they landed on a person's face. "I should have known," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but they were good at not being known. That's the whole point of what they built." She paused. "The question isn't what we missed. The question is what we build next." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, more like the expression of someone who had been holding a weight and found unexpectedly that part of it had been taken. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," Grace said. "Sir." His mouth almost moved. "Close enough. Get back to work, Mitchell." She got back to work. 3 months in, Doyle entered a plea agreement. He was not the first. 2 of the 4 initial arrests had already taken deals. Their testimony used to build the case against Voss and the organizational leadership. But Doyle was the one Harris had sat across from for 4 years, and the news of his plea reached Harris on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a text from Cho that said simply, "Doyle is cooperating. Full cooperation. He's giving us everything." Harris read it twice. He put his phone down. He looked at his desk, at the ordinary surface of it, the files and the coffee cup and the pen. He always kept in the same spot, even though he'd never consciously decided to keep it there. 4 years of a desk. 4 years of a partnership that had been a performance from one side. He thought about all the things Doyle would give them now, all the cases that would be reopened, all the people whose lives had been bent sideways by a corrupt network that had used the machinery of law enforcement as a tool against the law. He picked the pen up, put it back down. And then he went to find Grace. She was at her desk going through a file. She looked up when Harris approached. She read his face before he said a word. "Doyle," she said. "Full cooperation," Harris said. Grace was quiet for a moment. She looked at the file in front of her. She thought about Doyle in the interrogation room doorway, telling Ethan Walker he should have kept writing. She thought about how close it had been, how close the margin between she survived and she didn't had actually been, and how different this moment would look if the margin had gone the other way. "Good," she said. "Just that, clean and simple." Then she went back to her file. Harris stood there for a second. Then he nodded once and went back to his desk. They didn't need a longer conversation than that. The economy of it, of 2 people who have been through something real together and don't need to perform their feelings about it, was its own kind of truth. The thing that nobody had fully anticipated was the attention, not the news coverage that was expected, managed, dealt with by the department's communications office in careful press releases that Harris mostly ignored. The attention from inside the department, the way the story of Ethan Walker moved through the building, told and retold, growing slightly different with each telling the way stories do, accumulating small myths around its core of fact: the biker, the dying cop, the checkpoint in the rain. People asked Grace about it constantly at first. What was he like? What did he say? What did it feel like to have a Hell's Angel save your life? She answered the same way every time, briefly and directly, because she decided early that the story belonged to what happened and not to what people wanted to make it mean. "He saw someone who needed help," she said. "He helped. That's the whole thing." It was never the whole thing, of course. Stories never are. But it was the part that mattered, and she kept returning to it every time the conversation tried to drift into something more dramatic or more symbolic, pulling it back to the plain truth of it, the way you pull a kite string back when the wind starts taking it somewhere you didn't intend. Harris got a call from a journalist 4 months in. National outlet. They wanted to do a piece on the investigation on the corruption on the network and how it operated. And they wanted to talk to Ethan Walker. Harris gave the journalist Ethan's number with a single caveat. "He's going to say no." He was right. Ethan said no in approximately 9 words, which was 4 more words than the journalist had expected him to use, and hung up. The journalist called Harris back. He really won't. He really won't, Harris confirmed. Can you tell me why Swati? Harris thought about Ethan in the garage working on a transmission. Dutch across from him. The news scroll moving at the bottom of a screen he was barely watching. He thought about, I don't need the department to tell me whether what I did was right. I already know whether it was right. He thought about a man who made the right call at 2 in the morning and didn't need the morning to confirm it. Because he already knows what he did, Harris said. He doesn't need anyone else to tell him. A pause on the journalist's end. That's actually a pretty good quote, the journalist said. It wasn't meant to be, Harris said. I thought the story would fade. Stories do eventually, especially when the trial preparation stretched into months and the news cycle moved on to the next thing and the next thing after that. He thought Ethan Walker would go back to being whatever he was before a rainy Thursday night changed the shape of everything. He thought the space between a police department and a motorcycle club would close back to what it had been, not hostile exactly, but separate, defined, maintained on both sides by history and habit and the practical logic of two worlds that moved in different orbits. I was partially right and partially wrong in a way he hadn't predicted. The Voss trial started 8 months and 11 days after his arrest. Grace Mitchell was in the front row as promised on the first day. She was there every day after that. Her arm was fully healed. She was back on full duty. She sat in the gallery in civilian clothes, which was the right choice, deliberate, because she wasn't there as an officer. She was there as a witness and a human being who intended to watch this all the way to its end. On the 4th day of the trial, she came out of the courthouse at lunch and found Kevin Marsh on the steps. He was in civilian clothes, too off duty, carrying coffee he'd clearly been holding for a while. He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a moment of mutual recognition. Two people who had been part of the same story from different angles, who had never actually been in the same room before. Marsh, she said. Mitchell, he said. They stood there on the courthouse steps in the particular awkward way of people who know each other's significance but don't know each other as people yet. You built 14 months of documentation alone, she said. You gave your statement with 2 bullet wounds and a surgical drain still in, he said. Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her good hand. He shook it. They went back inside. Harris testified on the 7th day. He was on the stand for 4 hours. He was precise, he was direct, he was everything. He'd spent 23 years learning to be under examination, and when it was done, he walked out of the courtroom and stood in the hall and let himself be tired for exactly 3 minutes, and then he went back in. Grace caught up with him in the hall during a recess on day 11. You okay, she said. I've been asked better questions, he said. I've asked you better questions, she agreed. How's the testimony holding up? Cho's team has been thorough, Harris said. I don't think they're going to find a hole. He paused. Voss's attorneys are good. They're trying to build a case that a technical manipulation of the dispatch system could have been executed by any of 6 people with back-end access, and that there's no direct evidence Voss issued the order for the ambush specifically. Grace's jaw tightened slightly. Sandra's documentation puts the script installation in the window when Voss had sole elevated access. I know, Harris said. So does the jury. We'll see if they understand what that means. They understood. The verdict came on a Thursday, which Harris would note afterward, with a particular kind of quiet satisfaction, was the same night of the week as that Thursday 40 weeks ago, when Ethan Walker rode home through an industrial district and saw the lights of a wrecked police cruiser and stopped. Guilty on all 12 counts. The word came out of the jury foreman's mouth with a particular flatness of official language, stripped of drama. Just the word, and the count, and the word again, 12 times, and each time it landed the same way, clean and absolute and without possibility of being taken back. Grace sat in the front row and heard it 12 times and didn't move. She sat completely still through all 12. And then when the foreman sat down and the judge began to speak, she looked down at her hands in her lap and let out a breath that she thought she might have been holding in some form for 40 weeks. Harris was standing against the wall. He watched her. He watched the back of her head and the set of her shoulders, in the one moment when something released, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking closely, and thought about 40 weeks of this woman going to work every day and testifying and sitting in this room and carrying the weight of it forward one step at a time. Tough, Dutch had said, tougher than most of his guys. Harris had relayed the message. He thought Dutch might have underestimated it. He pulled out his phone. He typed a text to a number that had become more familiar over the past 40 weeks than he'd expected. Guilty, all 12 counts. The response came back in under a minute. 2 words. Good. Finally. Harris looked at it. He typed back, I believe there's a beer I owe you. A longer pause this time. Then Tuesday, 7 p.m. You know the bar on Penn Avenue? Harris did not in fact know the bar on Penn Avenue. He was going to find out. He put his phone away and went to find Grace. She was outside on the courthouse steps in the October air that had gone cold and sharp the way Pittsburgh air does when the fall really arrives. She had her jacket collar turned up and her arms crossed and her face turned slightly away from the building toward the street, toward the city, doing what cities do, moving indifferent, continuous. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. 12, she said. 12, he confirmed. She was quiet. Doyle, sentencing is next month, Harris said. With the cooperation agreement, probably 10 to 12 years. He'll serve 7 if he behaves. Grace considered that. 7 years. She looked at the street. She thought about the math of 7 years against the weight of what those years would be carrying. She didn't say whether it was enough or not enough. Some things don't have a clean answer, and she'd made her peace with that particular category of thing. Marsh is at the bar across the street, she said. He said he'd wait. Harris raised an eyebrow. You and Marsh are going for drinks. I'm going to say thank you to the person who spent 14 months building a case alone in the dark so that when the moment came, we had something to use. She looked at Harris. You should come. He started. Harris, she looked at him with the patient, direct expression of someone who has decided a thing and is waiting for the other person to catch up. You have an hour, come. He came. The bar was small and not busy, and Marsh was at a corner table with a beer he'd been working at for a while. He looked up when Harris and Grace walked in together, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who was still slightly amazed that the thing he had been building alone in secret had become a table in a bar, people around it. The verdict out there in the world already. They sat. They ordered. For a while, nobody said the obvious things because the obvious things felt redundant in the presence of people who had all been inside the same storm and knew what had actually happened without needing to narrate it. Then Marsh said, Walker. Grace looked at him. Is he? Marsh stopped. Tried again. I've been trying to figure out the right way to think about him. I don't have a framework for it. Grace looked at her glass for a moment. Neither do I, she said. And I've had 40 weeks to work on it. She looked up. I've decided maybe the right thing is to not need a framework. He did something real. That's enough. He saved your life, Harris said. More than once if you count the safe house. I count the safe house, Grace said. And he got nothing from it, Marsh said. Not bitterly, just observationally. The fact of it sitting in the air. He got what he needed from it, Grace said, which apparently isn't the same thing as what we'd expect someone to need. She looked at Harris. He's coming Tuesday. He agreed to a beer, Harris said. That's something. For him, it's considerable, Harris said. She nodded slowly. She picked up her glass. Marsh picked up his. Harris picked up his coffee, which was what he'd ordered because he still had work to do that evening, and he was 51 years old and had made peace with who he was. They didn't make a toast. It wasn't that kind of moment. They just drank and sat and let the quiet of the thing that was over settle around the table. Tuesday came. Harris found the bar on Penn Avenue without too much difficulty. He arrived at 6:58. Ethan was already there, which Harris was beginning to understand was also simply who he was. A man who was where he said he'd be when he said he'd be there, not because of performance, but because he'd internalized reliability as a value rather than a courtesy. I was at the bar, not at a table, working man posture, elbows down, not performing anything. He had a beer, and there was another one on the counter next to his that he'd apparently ordered ahead, which meant he'd decided Harris was coming even before Harris had fully committed to it. Harris sat down, picked up the beer, didn't say anything for a moment. 12 counts, Ethan said. He'd heard. 12, Harris confirmed. Ethan drank. How long? Sentencing is 2 weeks. Cho's team is pushing for 25 years. With the federal charges, it'll probably land between 18 and 22. Harris looked at his beer. He'll be in his late 70s if he serves the full term. Good, Ethan said. They were quiet for a moment. The bar moved around them, other people, other conversations, the ordinary sound of an ordinary. Tuesday night in a city that didn't know or particularly care that 2 men sitting at its bar had navigated something that had started on one of its bridges in the rain and had only now, 40 weeks later, arrived at its end. Mitchell's back on full duty, Harris said. I know, Ethan said, which surprised Harris slightly and then didn't. You've been keeping track. She sent me a text when she went back on full duty, Ethan said. One line, first day back, thought you should know. He looked at his beer. Something moved across his face that was private and genuine, and he didn't try to cover it. I didn't expect that. What did you say back? I said good. He paused. She said, I know. Something that might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth. She's a pain in the ass. She's remarkable, Harris said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Ethan said. Harris almost laughed. He took a drink instead. There's going to be a department ceremony, he said, 3 weeks, honoring officers who demonstrated extraordinary courage during the investigation. This is getting a commendation. He paused. They want to recognize you. Ethan looked at him. Not officially, Harris said quickly, not as a formal recipient, but the commissioner wants to acknowledge publicly what you did. On the record. With cameras. He watched Ethan's face. I told him you'd probably say no. No, Ethan said. I told him that. Then why are you asking? Because he asked me to ask, Harris said, and because I said I would. He looked at Ethan steadily. And because I think you should consider it, not for you, for what it means. Ethan looked at his beer. Every officer in that department is going to be in that room, Harris said. 40 years of assumptions about who is on which side of what. 40 years of the way things are, and the commissioner standing up and saying in front of all of them that a Hell's Angel is the reason one of their people is alive. That matters. Not for your reputation, for the conversation that comes after it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I don't do ceremonies, he said. I don't do cameras. I don't do anything that looks like I'm collecting something for what happened. He looked at Harris. I didn't stop on that road so that 40 weeks later, I could stand in a room full of cops and have my picture taken. I know, Harris said. But, Ethan said. Harris waited. Ethan looked at his beer for another moment. Tell them I'll be there, he said. Outside. After. If she wants to talk to me, she knows how to find me. Harris looked at him. That's your compromise. That's my answer, Ethan said. Harris accepted it because it was exactly right in the way that things are right when they come from someone who knows their own nature clearly enough not to negotiate against it. The ceremony was on a Saturday. The department's main assembly hall. Uniformed officers, plainclothes administrative staff, family members. The commissioner spoke. Harris sat in the third row and listened to the language of official recognition. Careful honorific, built for the record, and thought about how different it was from the language of what actually happened. Not dishonest, just institutional. The way institutions have to speak about things that happened outside their walls and outside their categories. Grace received her commendation last. She walked to the front of the room in her dress uniform, her arm completely healed, now both hands at her sides, and stood at the podium and spoke without notes. She talked about the night. She talked about what she remembered. She talked about the dispatch call and the bridge and the shots. And then she talked about opening her eyes and seeing a man in a Hell's Angels vest kneeling in the mud beside her, and what she'd felt and what she'd done and what he'd done. She talked about it plainly without drama, the way you talk about something true when the truth is already dramatic enough. She talked about what it meant that the person who crossed every line to save her was the person the system had defined as someone who shouldn't be trusted. She talked about what that taught her, not about bikers, not about cops, but about assumptions. About the difference between what you've been trained to expect and what you actually see when you look at a person directly. He didn't save a police officer that night, she said. She paused, not for effect, because the next words needed the space around them. He saved a human being, and I think the distinction is the most important thing I've learned in this job so far. The room was very quiet. Harris looked at the faces around him. 40 years of assumptions in those faces, some of them shifting. Not breaking assumptions don't break in a single moment. They erode gradually under the pressure of things that are more true than they are, but shifting, moving, making room for something more complicated and more honest than the thing that had been there before. After the ceremony, Grace came outside. Ethan was there, exactly where he'd said he'd be, standing beside his Harley, away from the entrance, away from the cameras that the department's communications office had set up for the post-ceremony coverage. He was in his jacket, his patch visible, his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked exactly like what he was. Grace walked toward him. She wasn't in uniform anymore. She'd changed before coming out, which was also deliberate, also right. She stopped about 4 feet away, and they looked at each other with the particular directness of two people who have seen each other at their most essential and have nothing left to perform. You came, she said. You knew I would, he said. I hoped, she said. I don't assume things about you anymore. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. Good habit, he said. She looked at him for a moment. She had been thinking about what to say to him, had been thinking about it for weeks, off and on, in the spaces between work and testimony, and healing and going back to work. She drafted versions of it in her head, careful ones, articulate ones, the kind that capture the weight of something accurately. And standing here now in front of him, all of those versions felt like exactly the wrong thing. Too worked, too constructed. The wrong language for the kind of truth that exists between people who have been in the mud together. So she said the simple thing, the real thing. You didn't save a police officer that night, she said. You saved a human being. He looked at her. He held her eyes for a moment in that still, direct way he had, the way of someone who receives things fully rather than deflecting them. He didn't argue with it. He didn't minimize it. He let it be what it was. You did the same, he said, in that room with Harris. When you told them it wasn't me, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said. Not everyone would have. That's not my problem, she said. I know what I saw. He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened to his face, the real thing, the unguarded thing, the thing that had been sitting underneath the flatness and the stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago to show very little. A small, real, entirely genuine thing that might have been gratitude and might have been recognition, and was probably both. You're going to be a hell of a cop, he said. I already am, she said. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. She heard it for the first time, and it surprised her, warm, brief, real. Then he reached back and put his hand on the Harley, and she understood that the moment was complete. Not because it needed to end, because it was finished the way things are finished when they've been done right. Walker, she said before he started the engine. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for all of it, not just the bridge, all of it. He looked at her for one more moment. The last moment of the thing that had started in the mud under a railway bridge 40 weeks ago in the rain, with a gun pointed at his chest and a woman bleeding and a choice that should have been easy and wasn't. He nodded once. He started the Harley. He rode away. Grace stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. The sound of it moving through the city, receding, becoming part of the ordinary noise of a Saturday afternoon in Pittsburgh. She stood there until she couldn't hear it anymore. Behind her, through the building's glass doors, she could see the ceremony winding down. People collecting coats, talking in small groups, moving towards the exits. The ordinary aftermath of an official event. Harris was visible through the glass, talking to Marsh. Both of them with the body language of people who are finally genuinely at ease after a very long time of not being. Sandra was there too, in civilian clothes, looking slightly uncertain about whether she belonged in the room. Grace made a note to find her before she left. To say the thing that needed to be said, that she belonged more than most of the people in uniform. That 14 months of carrying something alone in the dark was its own kind of courage. The kind that didn't wear a badge, but should. Kevin Marsh's file. Sandra's drive. Dutch's hands on her dressing. The anonymous calls in the rain. The gray sedan that Harris had lost in a parking garage. All the small, unglamorous acts of people doing the right thing when doing the right thing was the harder choice. The choice that cost something and didn't promise anything back. Grace turned around and walked back through the doors. She had work to do. Not dramatic work. Not the kind with a clean ending and a clear villain and a night under a bridge that changes everything in a single moment. The ordinary, daily, relentless work of being in the right place, doing the right thing, keeping her eyes open enough to see what was actually in front of her rather than what she expected to find. She thought about Ethan Walker riding through the city right now. She thought about the patch on his vest and the life it represented, everything that life was and wasn't, all the complicated, irreducible truth of it. She thought about the fact that he would go back to that life fully and completely, without apology, without transformation into something the world was more comfortable with. He wasn't a reformed man. He wasn't a changed man. He was exactly the man he'd always been, which was the man who stopped, which turned out to be enough, more than enough. She found Sandra near the exit code, already on, ready to slip out quietly, the way people slip out who aren't sure they were really invited. Grace stopped in front of her, and Sandra looked up with the slightly startled expression of someone who expected to be invisible. I owe you something, Grace said. You don't, Sandra started. I do, Grace said. You carried that drive for 6 weeks, alone, not knowing who to trust, not knowing if it would ever matter. She held Sandra's eyes. It mattered. Everything that happened, the warrants, the arrests, the trial, it went through that drive. You're at the center of this, whether anyone puts your name on a commendation or not. Sandra looked at her for a moment. Her jaw worked slightly. I was terrified, she said, every single day. I know, Grace said. MSN. That's what makes it something. Sandra nodded. Something in her shoulders released the specific release of a weight that has been carried long enough that the body has forgotten what it's like not to carry it. Carry it. She blinked once. Then she straightened up and said, Are you really as okay as you look? Grace considered that. It was the most genuine question anyone had asked her in weeks. I'm getting there, she said. I think that's the most honest answer I've got. Sandra nodded again. Good enough, she said. Harris found Grace by the coffee table 10 minutes later. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them passed the shorthand of people who have been through something together that they will spend the rest of their careers carrying, not as a burden exactly, but as a kind of permanent alteration, the way a bone knits differently at the sight of a break. You ready? He said. They were driving to a debrief with Cho's office final documentation, the official close of the investigative file. The last formal step before the case moved entirely into the hands of the prosecution. Always, she said. They walked out together, through the lobby, through the glass doors, into a Saturday afternoon that was doing nothing more significant than being a Saturday afternoon in Pittsburgh, ordinary, ambient, indifferent to what had happened inside the building behind them. The Hells Angels never became supporters of the Pittsburgh police. The Pittsburgh police never officially celebrated a Hells Angel. The investigation ran its course. Voss was sentenced to 21 years. Doyle served his cooperation agreement and was sentenced to 11. 4 other officers pleaded guilty. 3 went to trial. The criminal network that had been operating under police protection for nearly a decade was dismantled over the course of 18 months of coordinated federal and local work, and the neighborhoods it had operated in began slowly and imperfectly to recover. Grace Mitchell made detective 3 years later, the youngest in the department's history at that rank, which several people mentioned, and she acknowledged once and then put down and went back to work. Ethan Walker kept writing. He declined 5 separate interview requests, 2 documentary proposals, and 1 book deal. Dutch kept working on engines. The chapter kept meeting on Thursday nights. Harris retired at 28 years. He got a good turnout at the retirement party. He gave a short speech and meant most of it. He went home and slept for 11 hours and woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in longer than he could account for. Light, like a man who had been carrying the right weight for a long time and had finally on the right day been allowed to set it down. Grace kept her promise. She kept her eyes open. She kept being thorough. She kept asking the questions that needed asking, following the threads that needed following, seeing the people in front of her as people rather than categories. And on a Thursday night, 3 years after the night that changed everything, she was driving home through an industrial district on the edge of the city when she passed under a railway bridge and felt for just a moment the full weight of what had happened there. She slowed. She didn't stop. She looked out through her windshield at the underside of that bridge, at the concrete and the dark and the ordinary. Nothing of it, and she thought about what it meant that a man had looked at a dying cop and seen a human being first. She drove on. She drove through the city that was her city that she had chosen, that had broken her faith, and then helped her rebuild it into something sturdier and more honest than what it had been. And she carried forward the thing that night had put in her. Not the wound, the lesson. That the right thing doesn't come with a category. It doesn't come with a patch or a badge or a title or any of the markers we use to decide in advance who we're going to trust. It comes from a person in a moment making a choice when the choice costs something. It comes from a man on a motorcycle in the rain who saw something and stopped. And in that stopping, in that single irreducible human decision to not keep going, he changed everything that came after. That was the truth. That was all of it. And it was more than enough to last the rest of her life.